This is Audible.
Jamaica Inn by Daphne du Maurier. Read by Tony Britton. Chapter 1. It was a cold, grey day in late November. The weather had changed overnight, when a backing wind brought a granite sky and a mizzling rain with it, and although it was now only a little after 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the pallor of a winter evening seemed to have closed upon the hills, cloaking them in mist. It would be dark by 4. The air was clammy cold, and for all the tightly closed windows, it penetrated the interior of the coach. The leather seats felt damp to the hands, and there must have been a small crack in the roof, because now and again little drips of rain fell softly through, smudging the leather and leaving a dark blue stain like a splodge of ink. The wind came in gusts, at times shaking the coach as it travelled round the bend of the road, and in the exposed places on the high ground it blew with such force that the whole body of the coach trembled and swayed, rocking between the high wheels like a drunken man. The driver, muffled in a greatcoat to his ears, bent almost double in his seat in a faint endeavour to gain shelter from his own shoulders, while the dispirited horses plodded sullenly to his command, too broken by the wind and the rain to feel the whip that now and again cracked above their heads, while it swung between the numb fingers of the driver. The wheels of the coach creaked and groaned as they sank into the ruts on the road, and sometimes they flung up the soft, spattered mud against the windows, where it mingled with the constant driving rain, and whatever view there might have been of the countryside was hopelessly obscured. The few passengers huddled together for warmth, exclaiming in unison when the coach sank into a heavier rut than usual, and one old fellow who had kept up a constant complaint ever since he had joined the coach at Truro rose from his seat in a fury, and fumbling with the window sash, let the window down with a crash, bringing a shower of rain in upon himself and his fellow passengers. He thrust his head out and shouted up to the driver, cursing him in a high, petulant voice for a rogue and a murderer, that they would all be dead before they reached Bodmin if he persisted in driving at breakneck speed. They had no breath left in their bodies as it was, and he for one would never travel by coach again. Whether the driver heard him or not was uncertain. It seemed more likely that the stream of reproaches was carried away in the wind, for the old fellow, after waiting a moment, put up the window again, having thoroughly chilled the interior of the coach, and settling himself once more in his corner, wrapped his blanket about his knees and muttered in his beard. His nearest neighbour, a jovial, red-faced woman in a blue cloak, sighed heavily in sympathy, and with a wink to anyone who might be looking, and a jerk of her head towards the old man, she remarked for at least the 20th time that it was the dirtiest night she ever remembered, and she had known some, that it was proper old weather, and no mistake in it, for summer this time, and burrowing into the depths of a large basket she brought out a great hunk of cake and plunged into it with strong white teeth. Mary Yellan sat in the opposite corner, where the trickle of rain oozed through the crack in the roof. Sometimes a cold drip of moisture fell upon her shoulder, which she brushed away with impatient fingers. She sat with her chin cupped in her hands, her eyes fixed on the window splashed with mud and rain, hoping with a sort of desperate interest that some ray of light would break the heavy blanket of sky and but a momentary trace of that lost blue heaven that had mantled Helford yesterday shine for an instant as a forerunner of fortune. Already, though barely 40 miles by road from what had been her home for 23 years, the hope within her heart had tired, and that rather gallant courage which was so large a part of her, and had stood her in such stead during the long agony of her mother's illness and death, was now shaken by this first fall of rain and the nagging wind. The country was alien to her, which was a defeat in itself. As she peered through the misty window of the coach, she looked out upon a different world from the one she had known only a day's journey back. How remote now, and hidden perhaps forever, were the shining waters of Helford, the green hills and the sloping valleys, the white cluster of cottages at the water's edge. It was a gentle rain that fell at Helford, a rain that pattered in the many trees and lost itself in the lush grass, formed into brooks and rivulets that emptied into the broad river, sank into the grateful soil which gave back flowers in payment. This was a lashing, pitiless rain that stung the windows of the coach, and it soaked into a hard and barren soil. No trees here, save one or two that stretched bare branches to the four winds, bent and twisted from centuries of storm, and so black were they by time and tempest that even if spring did breathe on such a place, no buds would dare to come to leaf for fear the late frost should kill them. It was a scrubby land, without hedgerow or meadow, a country of stones, black heather, and stunted broom. There would never be a gentle season here, thought Mary, either grim winter as it was today, or else the dry and parching heat of midsummer, with never a valley to give shade or shelter, but grass that turned yellow-brown before May was past. The country had gone grey with the weather. Even the people on the road and in the villages changed in harmony with their background. At Helston, where she had taken the first coach, she had trodden familiar ground. So many childish memories clung about Helston. The weekly drive to market with her father in the vanished days, and when he was taken from them, the fortitude with which her mother held his place, driving backwards and forwards winter and summer, as he had done, with her hens and her eggs and her butter at the back of the cart, while Mary sat at her side, clutching a basket as big as herself, her small chin resting on the handle. Folk were friendly in Helston. The name of Yellan was known and respected in the town, for the widow had had a hard fight against life when her husband died, and there were not many women who would have lived alone as she did, with one child and a farm to tend, with never a thought of taking another man. There was a farmer at Monacan who would have asked her, had he dared, and another up the river at Gweek, but they could tell from her eyes she would have neither of them, but belonged in body and mind to the man who had gone. It was the hard work of the farm that told upon her in the end, for she would not spare herself, and though she had driven and flogged her energy for the 17 years of her widowhood, she could not stand up to the strain when the last test came, and her heart went from her. Little by little her stock had decreased, and with times being bad, so she was told in Helston, and prices fallen to nothing, there was no money anywhere. Up country it was the same. There would be starvation in the farms before long. Then a sickness attacked the ground, and killed the livestock in the villages round Helford. There was no name to it, and no cure could be discovered. It was a sickness that came over everything and destroyed much as a late frost will out of season, coming with the new moon and then departing, leaving no trace of its passage save the little trail of dead things in its path. It was an anxious, weary time for Mary Yellan and her mother. One by one they saw the chickens and the ducklings they had reared sicken and die, and the young calf fell in the meadow where he stood. The most pitiful was the old mare who had served them 20 years, and upon whose broad and sturdy back Mary had first straddled her young legs. She died in the stall one morning, her faithful head in Mary's lap. And when a pit was dug for her under the apple tree in the orchard, and she was buried, and they knew she would no longer carry them to Helston market day, Mary's mother turned to her and said, "There's something of me gone in the grave with poor Nell, Mary. I don't know whether it's my faith or what 'tis, but my heart feels tired, and I can't go on any more." She went into the house and sat down in the kitchen, pale as a sheet, and 10 years her age. Listless, she shrugged her shoulders when Mary said she would fetch the doctor. "'Tis too late, child," she said. 17 years too late. And she began to cry softly, who had never cried before. Mary fetched the old doctor who lived at Morgan, and who had brought her into the world, and as he drove her back in his trap he shook his head at her. "I tell you what 'tis, Mary," he said. "Your mother has spared neither her mind nor her body since your father died, and she has broken down at last. I don't like it. It's come at a bad time." They drove along the twisting lane to the farmhouse at the top of the village. A neighbour met them at the gate, her face eager to impart bad news. "Your mother's worse," she cried. "She came out of the door just now, staring like a ghost, and she trembled all over and fell down in the path. Mrs. Oblin's gone to her, and Will Searle, they've lifted her inside, poor soul. They say her eyes are shut." Firmly the doctor pushed the little gaping crowd away from the door. Together he and the man Searle lifted the still figure from the floor and carried her upstairs to the bedroom. "'Tis a stroke," said the doctor. "But she's breathing. Her pulse is steady." This is what I've been afraid of, that she'd snap suddenly like this. Why it's come just now after all these years is known only to the Lord and herself. You must prove yourself your parents' child now, Mary, and help her through this. You're the only one who can." For 6 long months or more, Mary nursed her mother in this her first and last illness, but with all the care she and the doctor gave her, it was not the widow's will to recover. She had no wish to fight for her life. It was as though she longed for release, and prayed silently that it would come quickly. She said to Mary, I don't want you to struggle as I've done. It's a breaking of the body and of the spirit. There is no call for you to stay on at Helford after I'm gone. It's best for you to go to your Aunt Patience, up to Bodmin." There was no use in Mary telling her mother that she would not die. It was fixed there in her mind, and there was no fighting it. "I haven't any wish to leave the farm, Mother," she said. "I was born here, and my father before me, and you were a Helford woman. This is where the Yellans belong to be. I'm not afraid of being poor and the farm falling away. You worked here for 17 years alone, so why shouldn't I do the same? I'm strong. I can do the work of a man, you know that." "There's no life for a girl," said her mother. "I did it all these years because of your father and because of you. Working for someone keeps a woman calm and contented, but it's another thing when you work for yourself. There's no heart in it then." "I'd be no use in a town," said Mary. "I've never known anything but this life by the river, and I don't want to. Going into Helston is town enough for me. I'm best here, with the few chickens that's left to us, and the green stuff in the garden, and the old pig, and a bit of a boat on the river. What would I do up to Bodmin with my Aunt Patience? A girl can't live alone, Mary, without she goes queer in the head, or comes to evil. It's either one or the other. Have you forgotten poor Sue, who walked the churchyard at midnight with the full moon, and called upon the lover she had never had? And there was one maid, before you were born, left an orphan at 16. She ran away to Falmouth, and went with the sailors. I'd not rest in my grave, nor your father neither, if we didn't leave you safe. You like your Aunt Patience. She was always a great one for games and laughing, with a heart as large as life. You remember when she came here 12 years back? She had ribbons in her bonnet, and a silk petticoat. There was a fellow working at Trellawarren had an eye to her, but she thought herself too good for him." Yes, Mary remembered Aunt Patience, with her curled fringe and large blue eyes, and how she laughed and chatted, and how she picked up her skirts and tiptoed through the mud in the yard. She was as pretty as a fairy. "What sort of a man your Uncle Joshua is, I cannot say," said her mother. "For I've never set eyes on him, nor known anyone what has. But when your aunt married him, 10 years ago last Michaelmas, she wrote a pack of giddy nonsense you'd expect a girl to write, and not a woman over 30. "They'd think me rough," said Mary. "I haven't the pretty manners they'd expect. We wouldn't have much to say to one another. They'll love you for yourself, and not for any airs and graces. I want you to promise me this, child, that when I'm gone you'll write to your Aunt Patience, and tell her that it was my last and dearest wish that you should go to her." "I promise," said Mary. but her heart was heavy and distressed at the thought of a future so insecure and changed, with all that she had known and loved gone from her, and not even the comfort of familiar trodden ground to help her through the bad days when they came. Daily her mother weakened. Daily the life ebbed from her. She lingered through harvest time, and through the fruit-picking, and through the first falling of the leaves. But when the mists came in the morning, and the frosts settled on the ground, and the swollen river ran in flood to meet the boisterous sea, and the waves thundered and broke on the little beaches of Helford, the widow turned restlessly in her bed, plucking at the sheets. She called Mary by her dead husband's name, and spoke of things that were gone, and of people Mary had never known. For 3 days she lived in a little world of her own, and on the 4th day she died. One by one, Mary saw the things she had loved and understood pass into other hands. The livestock went at Helston Market. The furniture was bought by neighbours, stick by stick. A man from cowering took a fancy to the house and purchased it. With pipe in mouth he straddled the yard, and pointed out the changes he would make, the trees he would cut down to clear his view, while Mary watched him in dumb loathing from her window as she packed her small belongings in her father's trunk. This stranger from cowering made her an interloper in her own home. She could see from his eye he wanted her to be gone, and she had no other thought now but to be away and out of it all, and her back turned forever. Once more she read the letter from her aunt, written in a cramped hand on plain paper. The writer said she was shocked at the blow that had befallen her niece, that she had no idea her sister was ill. It was so many years now since she had been to Helford. And she went on, "There have been changes with us you would not know. I no longer live in Bodmin, but nearly 12 miles outside, on the road to Launceston. It's a wild and lonely spot, and if you were to come to us, I should be glad of your company winter time. I have asked your uncle, and he does not object, he says, if you are quiet-spoken and not a talker, and will give help when needed. He cannot give you money or feed you for nothing, as you will understand. He will expect your help in the bar in return for your board and lodging. You see, your uncle is the landlord of Jamaica Inn." Mary folded the letter and put it in her trunk. It was a strange message of welcome from the smiling Aunt Patience she remembered. A cold, empty letter, giving no word of comfort, and admitting nothing except that her niece must not ask for money. Aunt Patience, with her silk petticoat and delicate ways, the wife of an innkeeper. Mary decided that this was something her mother had not known. The letter was very different from the one penned by a happy bride 10 years ago. However, Mary had promised, and there was no returning on her word. Her home was sold. There was no place for her here. Whatever her welcome should be, her aunt was her own mother's sister, and that was the one thing to remember. The old life lay behind, the dear familiar farm and the shining Helford waters. Before her lay the future, and Jamaica Inn. And so it was that Mary Yellan found herself northward bound from Helston in the creaking, swaying coach, through Truro town at the head of the Fowl, with its many roofs and spires, its broad cobbled streets, the blue sky overhead still speaking of the south, the people at the doors smiling and waving as the coach rattled past. But when Truro lay behind in the valley, the sky came overcast, and the country on either side of the high road grew rough and untilled. Villages were scattered now, and there were few smiling faces at the cottage doors. Trees were sparse, hedges there were none. Then the wind blew, and the rain came with the wind. And so the coach rumbled into Bodmin, grey and forbidding like the hills that cradled it, and one by one the passengers gathered up their things in preparation for departure, all save Mary, who sat still in her corner. The driver, his face a stream of rain, looked in at the window. "Are you going on to Launceston?" he said. "It'll be a wild drive tonight across the moors. You can stay in Bodmin, you know, and go on by coach in the morning. There'll be none in this coach going on but you." "My friends will be expecting me," said Mary. "I'm not afraid of the drive, and I don't want to go as far as Launceston.
Will you please put me down at Jamaica Inn?"
The man looked at her curiously. "Jamaica Inn," he said. "What would you be doing at Jamaica Inn? That's no place for a girl. You must have made a mistake, surely." He stared at her hard, not believing her.
"Oh, I've heard it's lonely enough," said Mary. "But I don't belong to a town anyway. It's quiet on Helford River, winter and summer, where I come from, and I never felt lonely there."
"I never said nothing about loneliness," answered the man. "Maybe you don't understand, being a stranger up here. It's not the 20-odd mile of moor I'm thinking of, though that'd scare most women. Here, wait a minute."
He called over his shoulder to a woman who stood in the doorway of the Royal, lighting the lamp above the porch, for it was already dusk.
"Missus," he said, "come here and reason with this young girl. I was told she was for Launceston, but she's asked me to put her down at Jamaica."
The woman came down the steps and peered into the coach. "There's a wild, rough place up there," she said. "And if it's work you're looking for, you won't find it on the farms. They don't like strangers on the moors. You'd do better down here in Bodmin." Mary smiled at her. "I shall be all right," she said. "I'm going to relatives. My uncle is landlord of Jamaica Inn." There was a long silence. In the grey light of the coach, Mary could see that the woman and the man were staring at her. She felt chilled suddenly, anxious. She wanted some word of reassurance from the woman, but it did not come. Then the woman drew back from the window. "I'm sorry," she said. "'Tis none of my business, of course. Good night." The driver began to whistle, rather red in the face, as one who wishes to rid himself of an awkward situation. Mary leant forward impulsively and touched his arm. "Would you tell me?" she said. "I shan't mind what you say. Is my uncle not liked? Is something the matter?" The man looked very uncomfortable. He spoke gruffly and avoided her eyes.
"Jamaica's got a bad name," he said. "Queer tales get about, you know how 'tis, but I don't want to make any trouble. Maybe they're not true."
"What sort of tales?" asked Mary. "Do you mean there's much drunkenness there? Does my uncle encourage bad company?"
The man would not commit himself. "I don't want to make trouble," he repeated. "And I don't know anything. It's only what people say. Respectable folk don't go to Jamaica any more. That's all I know. In the old days we used to water the horses there and feed them and go in for a bit of a bite and a drink. Well, we don't stop there any more. We whip the horses past and wait for nothing, not till we get to 5 lanes, and then we don't bide long."
"Why don't folk go there? What is their reason?" Mary persisted. The man hesitated. It was as though he were searching for words.
"They're afraid,"
he said at last, and then he shook his head. He would say no more. Perhaps he felt he had been churlish and was sorry for her, for a moment later he looked in at the window again and spoke to her.
"Will you not take a cup of tea here before we go?" he said. "It's a long drive before you, and it's cold on the moors."
Mary shook her head. Desire for food had left her, and though the tea would have warmed her, she did not wish to descend from the coach and walk into the Royal, where the woman would have stared at her, and people would murmur. Besides, there was a little nagging coward in her that whispered, "Stay in Bodmin, stay in Bodmin," and for all she knew she might have given way to it in the shelter of the Royal. She had promised her mother to go to Aunt Patience, and there must be no going back on her given word.
"We'd best be going, then," said the driver. "You're the only traveller on the road tonight. Here's another rug for your knees. I'll whip the horses on when we climb the hill out of Bodmin, for 'tis no night for the road. I shan't be easy in my mind until I reach my bed in Launceston. There's not many of us likes to cross the moors in winter-time, not when the weather's dirty." He slammed the door and climbed to his seat. The coach rumbled away down the street, past the safe and solid houses, the busy winking lights, the scattered people hurrying home for supper, their figures bowed against the wind and rain. Through the shuttered windows Mary could see chinks of friendly candlelight. There would be a fire within the grate, and a cloth spread on the table, a woman and children sitting down to their meal while the man warmed his hands before the cheerful blaze. She thought of the smiling countrywoman who had been her fellow passenger. She wondered if she was now sitting at her own table, with her children by her side. How comfortable she had been, with her apple cheeks, her rough, worn hands. What a world of security in her deep voice. And Mary made a little story to herself of how she might have followed her from the coach and prayed her company and asked her for a home. Nor would she have been refused, she was certain of that. There would have been a smile for her and a friendly hand and a bed for her. She would have served the woman and grown to love her, shared something of her life, become acquainted with her people. Now the horses were climbing the steep hill out of the town, and looking through the windows at the back of the coach, Mary could see the lights of Bodmin fast disappearing, one by one, until the last glimmer winked and flickered, and was gone. She was alone now with the wind and the rain, and 12 long miles of barren moor between her and her destination. She wondered if this was how a ship felt when the security of harbour was left behind. No vessel could feel more desolate than she did, not even if the wind thundered in the rigging and the sea licked her decks. It was dark in the coach now, for the torch gave forth a sickly yellow glare, and the draught from the crack in the roof sent the flame wandering hither and thither to the danger of the leather, and Mary thought it best to extinguish it. She sat huddled in her corner, swaying from side to side as the coach was shaken, and it seemed to her that never before had she known there was malevolence in solitude. The very coach which all the day had rocked her like a cradle now held a note of menace in its creaks and groans. The wind tore at the roof, and the showers of rain, increasing in violence now there was no shelter from the hills, spat against the windows with new venom. On either side of the road the country stretched interminably into space. No trees, no lanes, no cluster of cottages or hamlet, but mile upon mile of bleak moorland, dark and untraversed, rolling like a desert land to some unseen horizon. No human being could live in this wasted country, thought Mary, and remain like other people. The very children would be born twisted like the blackened shrubs of broom, bent by the force of a wind that never ceased, blow as it would from east and west, from north and south. Their minds would be twisted too, their thoughts evil, dwelling as they must amidst marshland and granite, harsh heather and crumbling stone. They would be born of strange stock who slept with this earth as a pillow beneath this black sky. They would have something of the devil left in them still. On wound the road through this dark and silent land, with never a light to waver for an instant as a message of hope to the traveller within the coach. Perhaps there was no habitation in all the long 21 miles that stretched between the two towns of Bodmin and Launceston. Perhaps there was not even a poor shepherd's hut on the desolate highway. Nothing but the one grim landmark that was Jamaica Inn. Mary lost count of time and space. The miles might have been 100, and the hour midnight, for all she knew. She began to cling to the safety of the coach. At least it had some remnant of familiarity. She had known it since the early morning, and that was long ago. However great a nightmare was this eternal drive, there were at least the 4 close walls to protect her, the shabby, leaking roof, and, within calling distance, the comfortable presence of the driver. At last it seemed to her that he was driving his horses to an even greater speed. She heard him shout to them, the cry of his voice blown past her window on the wind. She lifted the sash and looked out. She was met with a blast of wind and rain that blinded her for the moment, and then, shaking clear her hair and pushing it from her eyes, she saw that the coach was topping the breast of a hill at a furious gallop, while on either side of the road was rough moorland, looming ink-black in the mist and rain. Ahead of her, on the crest and to the left, was some sort of a building standing back from the road. She could see tall chimneys, murky dim in the darkness. There was no other house, no other cottage. If this was Jamaica, it stood alone in glory, 4 square to the wind. Mary gathered her cloak around her and fastened the clasp. The horses had been pulled to a standstill and stood sweating under the rain, the steam coming from them in a cloud. The driver climbed down from his seat, pulling her box down with him. He seemed hurried, and he kept glancing over his shoulder towards the house.
"Here you are," he said. "Cross the yard there, yonder. If you hammer on the door, they'll let you in. I must be getting on, or I'll not reach Launceston tonight."
In a moment he was up on his seat again and picking up the reins. He shouted at his horses, whipping them in a fever of anxiety. The coach rumbled and shook, and in a moment it was away and down the road, disappearing as though it had never been, lost and swallowed up in the darkness. Mary stood alone, with the trunk at her feet. She heard a sound of bolts being drawn in the dark house behind her, and the door was flung open. A great figure strode into the yard, swinging a lantern from side to side.
"Who is it?"
came the shout.
"What do you want here?"
Mary stepped forward and peered up into the man's face. The light shone in her eyes, and she could see nothing. He swung the lantern to and fro before her, and suddenly he laughed and took hold of her arm, pulling her roughly inside the porch.
"Oh, it's you, is it?" he said. "So you've come to us after all. I'm your Uncle Jos Merlyn, and I bid you welcome to Jamaica Inn."
He drew her into the shelter of the house, laughing again, and shut the door, and stood the lantern upon a table in the passage. And they looked upon each other, face to face. Chapter 2. He was a great husk of a man, nearly 7 feet high, with a creased black brow and a skin the colour of a gypsy. His thick, dark hair fell over his eyes in a fringe and hung about his ears. He looked as if he had the strength of a horse, with immense, powerful shoulders, long arms that reached almost to his knees, and large fists like hams. His frame was so big that in a sense his head was dwarfed and sunk between his shoulders, giving that half-stooping impression of a giant gorilla, with his black eyebrows and his mat of hair. But for all his long limbs and mighty frame, there was nothing of the ape about his features, for his nose was hooked, curving to a mouth that might have been perfect once, but was now sunken and fallen, and there was still something fine about his great dark eyes, in spite of the lines and pouches and the red blood flecks. The best things left to him were his teeth, which were all good still and very white, so that when he smiled they showed up clearly against the tan of his face, giving him the lean and hungry appearance of a wolf. And although there should be a world of difference between the smile of a man and the bared fangs of a wolf, with Jos Merlyn they were one and the same.
"So, you are Mary Yellan,"
he said at length, towering above her, his head bent to observe her more closely.
"And you've come all this way to look after your Uncle Jos. I call it very handsome of you."
He laughed again, mocking her, his laugh bellowing through the house, acting like a lash on the strung nerves of Mary. "Where is my Aunt Patience?" she asked, glancing around her in the dimly lit passage, cheerless, with its cold stone flags and narrow, rickety staircase. "Is she not expecting me, then?"
"Where's my Aunt Patience?" mimicked the man. "Where's my dear auntie to kiss me and daddle me and make much of me? Can't you wait an instant without running to her? Haven't you a kiss for your Uncle Jos?"
Mary drew back. The thought of kissing him revolted her. He was either mad or drunk anyway, probably both. She did not want to anger him, though. She was too frightened for that. He saw the question pass through her mind, and he laughed again.
"Oh, no," he said. "I'm not going to touch you. You're as safe as a church with me. I never did like dark women, my dear, and I've better things to do than to play cat's cradle with me own niece."
He jeered down at her contemptuously, treating her like a fool, tired of his joke. Then he lifted his head to the stairs.
"Patience!"
he roared.
"What in hell are you doing? Here's the girl arrived, whimpering for you. She's sick of the sight of me already."
There was a little flutter at the head of the stairs, and a footstep dragged. Then the flicker of a candle, and an exclamation, Down the narrow stairs came a woman, shielding the light from her eyes. She wore a dingy mob-cap on her thin grey hair, which hung in elf-locks to her shoulders. She had turned the edges of her hair in a vain attempt to recapture ringlets, but the curl had gone. Her face had fallen away, and the skin was stretched tight across her cheekbones. Her eyes were large and staring, as though they asked perpetually a question, and she had a little nervous trick of working her mouth, now pursing the lips and now relaxing them. She wore a faded, striped petticoat that had once been cherry-coloured and was now a washed-out pink, and over her shoulders was flung a much-mended shawl. She had obviously just strung a new ribbon in her cap in some small attempt to brighten her dress, and it struck a false, incongruous note. It was bright scarlet, and showed up in horrible contrast to the pallor of her face. Mary stared at her dumbly, stricken with sorrow. Was this poor tattered creature the bewitching Aunt Patience of her dreams, dressed now like a slattern, and 20 years her age? The little woman came down the stairs and into the hall. She took Mary's hands in hers and peered into her face. "Have you really come?" she whispered. "It is my niece, Mary Yellan, isn't it? My dead sister's child?" Mary nodded, thanking God that her mother could not see her now. "Dear Aunt Patience," she said, "I'm glad to see you again. It's so many long years since you came to us at Helford." The woman kept pawing her with her hands, stroking her clothes, feeling her, and suddenly she clung to her, burying her head against her shoulder, and she began to cry, loudly and fearfully, drawing her breath in gasps.
"Oh, stop that,"
growled her husband.
"What sort of welcome's this? What have you got to squark about, you damn fool? Can't you see the girl wants her supper? Get her into the kitchen and give her some bacon and a drink."
He bent down and shouldered Mary's box, as though it weighed less than a paper packet.
"I'll take this to her room," he said. "And if you've not got a bite of supper on the table by the time I'm down again, I'll give you something to cry about. And you too, if you like," he added, thrusting his face into Mary's and laying one great finger across her mouth. "Are you tame, or do you bite?" he said. And then he laughed once more, bellowing to the roof, and thundered up the narrow stairs with the box swaying on his shoulders. Aunt Patience controlled herself. She made a tremendous effort and smiled, patting her thin locks into place in an old gesture that Mary half remembered, and then, blinking nervously and working her mouth, she led the way to yet another murky passage, and so into the kitchen, which was lit by 3 candles, while a low turf fire smouldered on the hearth. You mustn't mind your Uncle Joss," she said, her manner changing suddenly, fawning almost, like a whimpering dog that has been trained by constant cruelty to implicit obedience, and who, in spite of kicks and curses, will fight like a tiger for its master. "Your uncle must be humoured, you know. He has his ways, and strangers don't understand him at first. He's a very good husband to me, and has been so since our wedding day." She pattered on mechanically, going backwards and forwards across the flagged kitchen as she laid the table for supper, taking bread, cheese, and dripping from the big cupboard behind the panelling, while Mary crouched beside the fire in a hopeless attempt to warm her chilled fingers. The kitchen was heavy with peat smoke. It crept up to the ceiling and into the corners, and hung about the air like a thin blue cloud. It stung Mary's eyes, and explored her nostrils, and lay upon her tongue. "You'll soon come to like your Uncle Joss, and fit into his ways," continued her aunt. "He's a very fine man, and a very brave one. He has a great name hereabouts, and is much respected. There's no one will say a word against Joss Merlyn. We have great company here at times. It's not always as quiet as this. It's a very busy highway, you know. The coaches pass every day, and the gentry are most civil to us, most civil. A neighbour was in only yesterday, and I made him a cake to take home. 'Mrs. Merlyn,' he said, 'you're the only woman in Cornwall can bake a cake.
Those were his very words. And even the squire himself, that Squire Bassett, you know, from North Hill, he owns all the land hereabouts. He passed me on the road the other day, Tuesday it was, and he took off his hat. 'Good morning, madam,' he said, and he bowed to me from his horse. They say he was a great man for the women in his day. Then out comes Joss from the stable, where he had been mending the wheel of the trap. 'How's life, Mr. Bassett?' he says. 'As large as yourself, Joss,' answers the squire, and they both fell to laughing."
Mary murmured some reply to this little speech, but she was pained and worried to see how, when speaking, Aunt Patience avoided her eyes, and the very fluency of her words was in itself suspicious. She spoke much as a child does, who tells herself a story and has a talent for invention. It hurt Mary to see her act this part, and she longed for her to be done with it or be silent, for the flow of words was, in its way, more appalling than her tears had been. There was a footfall outside the door, and with a sinking heart Mary realized that Joss Merlyn had come downstairs again and had in all possibility listened to his wife's conversation. Aunt Patience heard him too, for she turned pale and began to work her mouth. He came into the room and looked from one to the other.
"So, the hens are clacking already,"
he said, the smile of the laugh gone, his eyes narrow.
"You'll soon stop your tears if you can talk. I heard you, you blathering fool. Gobble, 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 like a turkey hen. You think your precious niece believes a word you say? Why, you wouldn't take in a child, far less a bunch of petticoats like her."
He pulled a chair from the wall and crashed it against the table. He sat down heavily, the chair creaking beneath him, and reaching for the loaf, cut himself off a great hunk of bread which he slabbed with dripping. He crammed it into his mouth, the grease running down his chin, and beckoned Mary to the table.
"You need food, I can see that,"
he said, and he proceeded to cut carefully a thin slice from the loaf, which he quartered in pieces and buttered for her. The whole business very delicately done, and in striking contrast to his manner in serving himself, so much so that to Mary there was something almost horrifying in the change from rough brutality to fastidious care. It was as though there was some latent power in his fingers, which turned them from bludgeons into deft and cunning servants. Had he cut her a chunk of bread and hurled it at her, she would not have minded so much. It would have been in keeping with what she had seen of him. But this sudden coming to grace, this quick and exquisite moving of his hands, was a swift and rather sinister revelation. Sinister because it was unexpected and not true to type. She thanked him quietly and began to eat. Her aunt, who had not uttered since her husband entered the room, was frying bacon over the fire. No one spoke. Mary was aware of Joss Merlyn watching her across the table, and behind her she could hear her aunt fumbling with ineffectual fingers at the hot handle of the frying-pan. In a minute she had dropped it, uttering a little cry of distress. Mary rose from her place to help her, but Joss thundered at her to sit down.
"One fool is bad enough without making a couple of them," he shouted. "Keep your seat and let your aunt clear up a mess. Won't be for the first time."
He leant back in his chair and began to pick his teeth with his nails.
"What'll you drink?" he asked her. "Brandy, wine, or ale? You may starve here, but you won't go thirsty. We don't get sore throats at Jamaica."
And he laughed at her and winked and put out his tongue.
"I'll have a cup of tea, if I may," said Mary. "I'm not used to drinking spirits, nor wine neither."
"Oh, you're not? Oh, well, it's your loss, I'm glad to say. You can have your tea tonight, but by God, you'll want some brandy in a month or two."
He reached across the table and took hold of her hand. "You've a pretty enough paw for one who's worked on a farm," he said. "I was afraid 'twould be rough and red. If there's one thing that makes a man sick, it's to have his ale poured out by an ugly hand. Not that my customers are over-particular, but then we've never had a barmaid before at Jamaica Inn." He gave her a mock bow and dropped her hand. "Patience, my dear," he said.
Here's the key. Go and fetch me a bottle of brandy, for the Lord's sake. I've a thirst on me that all the waters of Dozmery would not slake.
His wife hurried across the room at his word, and disappeared into the passage. Then he fell to picking his teeth again, whistling from time to time, while Mary ate her bread and butter and drank the tea that he placed before her. Already a splitting headache tightened her brow, and she was ready to drop. Her eyes watered from the peat smoke. But she was not too tired to watch her uncle, for already she had caught something of the nervousness of her Aunt Patience, and felt that in some sense they were here like mice in a trap, unable to escape, with him playing with them like a monstrous cat. In a few minutes his wife returned with the brandy, which she put in front of her husband, and while she finished her cooking of the bacon and served Mary and herself, he fell to drinking, staring moodily before him, kicking the leg of the table. Suddenly he thumped the table with his fist, shaking the plates and cups while one platter crashed to the floor and broke.
"I'll tell you what it is, Mary Yellan," he shouted. "I'm master in this house, and I'll have you know it. You'll do as you're told, and help in the house and serve my customers, and I'll not lay a finger on you, but by God, if you open your mouth and squawk, I'll break you until you eat out of my hand, the same as your aunt yonder."
Mary faced him across the table. She held her hands in her lap so that he should not see them tremble. "I understand you," she said. "I'm not curious by nature, and I've never gossiped in my life. It doesn't matter to me what you do in the inn or what company you keep. I'll do my work in the house, and you'll have no cause to grumble. But if you hurt my Aunt Patience in any way, I tell you this, I'll leave Jamaica Inn straight away, and I'll find the magistrate, and bring him here and have the law on you. And then try and break me if you like." Mary had turned very pale, and she knew that if he thundered at her now she would break down and cry, and he would have the mastery of her forever. The torrent of words had come from her in spite of herself, and wrung with pity for the poor broken thing that was her aunt. She could not control them. Had she but known it, she had saved herself, for her little show of spirit impressed the man, and he leant back in his chair and relaxed.
"Oh, that's very pretty," he said. "Very prettily put, indeed. Now we know just what sort of lodger we have. Scratch her, and she shows her claws. All right, my dear. You and I are more akin than I thought. If we're going to play, we'll play together. I may have work for you at Jamaica one day, work that you've never done before. Man's work, Mary Yellan, where you play with life and death."
Mary heard her Aunt Patience give a little gasp beside her. "Oh, Joss! Oh, Joss, please!" There was so much urgency in her voice that Mary stared at her in surprise. She saw her aunt lean forward and motion her husband to be silent, and the very eagerness of her chin and the agony in her eyes frightened Mary more than anything that had happened that night. She felt eerie suddenly, chilled and rather sick. What had roused Aunt Patience to such panic? What had Joss Merlyn been about to say? She was aware of a fevered and rather terrible curiosity. Her uncle waved his hand impatiently.
"Oh, get out of bed, Patience," he said. "I'm tired of your death's head at my supper table. This girl and I understand one another."
The woman rose at once and went to the door, with a last ineffectual glance of despair over her shoulder. They heard her patter up the stairs. Joss Merlyn and Mary were alone. He pushed the empty brandy glass away from him and folded his arms on the table.
"There's been one weakness in my life, and I'll tell you what it is," he said. "It's drink. It's a curse, and I know it. I can't stop myself. One day it'll be the end of me, and a good job, too. There's days go by, and I don't touch more than a drop, same as I've done tonight. And then I'll feel the thirst come on me, and I'll soak. soak for hours. Oh, it's power and glory and women and the kingdom of God all rolled into one. I feel a king then, Mary. I feel I got the strings of the world between my two fingers. It's heaven and hell. I talk, then. Talk until every damned thing I've ever done is spilt to the four winds. I shut myself in my room and shout my secrets in my pillow. Your aunt turns the key on me. When I'm sober, I hammer on the door and she lets me out. There's no one knows that but she and I, and now I've told you. I've told you because I'm already a little drunk, and I can't hold my tongue. But I'm not drunk enough to lose my head. I'm not drunk enough to tell you why I live in this God-forgotten spot, and why I'm the landlord of Jamaica Inn. His voice was hoarse, and now he scarcely spoke above a whisper. The turf fire had sunk low in the hearth, and dark shadows stretched long fingers on the wall. The candles, too, had burnt down, and cast a monstrous shadow of Joss Merlyn on the ceiling. He smiled at her, and with a foolish, drunken gesture he laid his finger against his nose. "I've not told you that, Mary Yellan. Oh, no. I've got some sense and cunning left. If you want to know any more, you can ask your aunt. She'll pull you a tale." "I heard her blathering tonight, telling you we kept fine company here, and the squire takes his hat off to her. It's lies, all lies. I'll tell you that much, for you'll come to know it anyway. Squire Bassett's too mortal scared to shove his nose in here. If he saw me in the road, he'd cross his heart and spur his horse, and so would all the precious gentry. The coaches don't stop here now, nor the mails neither. Well, I don't worry. Customers enough. The wider berth the gentry give to me, the better pleased I am. Oh, there's drinking here, all right, and plenty of it, too. There's some who come to Jamaica Saturday night, and there's some who turn the key of their door and sleep with their fingers in their ears. There are nights when every cottage on the moor is dark and silent, and the only lights for miles are the blazing windows of Jamaica Inn. I say the shouting and the singing can be heard as far down as the farms below Rough Tor. You'll be in the bar those nights, if you've a fancy for it, and you'll see what company I keep." Mary sat very still, gripping the sides of her chair. She dared not move, for fear of that swift changing of his mood which she had observed already, and which would turn him from this sudden intimate tone of confidence to a harsh and coarse brutality. They're all afraid of me," he went on. "The whole damn lot of 'em afraid of me. Who's afraid of no man? I tell you, if I'd had education, if I'd had learning, I'd have walked the breadth of England beside King George himself. Oh, it's drink that's been against me. Drink. And my hot blood. It's the curse of all of us, Mary. There's never been a Merlyn yet that died peaceful in his bed. My father, who was hanged at Exeter, he had a brawl with a feller, killed him. My granddad had his ears cut for thieving. He was sent out to a convict settlement and died raving mad from a snake bite in the tropics. I'm the eldest of 3 brothers, all of us born under the shadow of Kilmar, away yonder above 12 men's moor. You walk out over there across the east moor till you come to Rushyford, and you'll see a great crag of granite like a devil's hand sticking up into the sky. That's Kilmar. If you'd been born under its shadow, you'd take to drink same as I did. My brother Matthew, he was drowned into Water Marsh. We thought he'd gone for a sailor and had no news of him, and then in the summer there was a drought, and no rain fell for 7 months, and there was Matthew, sticking up in the bog, with his hands above his head, and the curlews flying round him. My brother, Jem, damn him, he was the baby, hanging on to mother's skirts when Matt and I were grown men. I never did see eye to eye with Jem. Too smart he is, too sharp with his tongue. Oh, they'll catch him in time, and hang him same as they did my father.
He fell silent a moment, gazing at his empty glass. He picked it up and put it down again.
No, he said. I've said enough. I'll have no more tonight. Go up to bed, Mary, before I wring your neck. Here's your candle. You'll find your room over the porch.
Mary took the candlestick without speaking, and was about to pass him when he seized hold of her shoulder and twisted her round.
There'll be nights sometimes when you hear wheels on the road, he said. And those wheels will not pass on, but they'll stop outside Jamaica Inn. And you'll hear footsteps in the yard and voices beneath your window. When that happens, you'll stay in your bed, Mary Yellan, and cover your head with the blankets. Do you understand?
Yes, Uncle.
Very well. Now get out. And if you ever ask me a question again, I'll break every bone in your body.
She went out of the room and into the dark passage, bumping against the settle in the hall, and so upstairs, feeling her way with her hands, judging her whereabouts by turning round and facing the stairs again. Her uncle had told her the room over the porch, and she crept across the dark landing, which was unlit, past 2 doors on either side. Guest rooms, she imagined, waiting for those travellers who never came nowadays, nor sought shelter beneath the roof of Jamaica Inn. And then stumbled against another door, and turned the handle, and saw by the flickering flame of her candle that this was her room, for her trunk lay on the floor. The walls were rough and unpapered, and the floorboards bare. A box turned upside down served as a dressing table, with a cracked looking-glass on top. There was no jug or basin. She supposed she would wash in the kitchen. The bed creaked when she leant upon it, and the 2 thin blankets felt damp to her hand. She decided she would not undress, but would lie down upon it in her travelling clothes, dusty as they were, with her cloak wrapped round her. She went to the window and looked out. The wind had dropped, but it was still raining, a thin, wretched drizzle that trickled down the side of the house and smeared the dirt on the window-pane. A noise came from the far end of the yard, a curious groaning sound, like an animal in pain. It was too dark to see clearly, but she could make out a dark shape swinging gently to and fro. For one nightmare of a moment, her imagination on fire with the tales Joss Merlyn had told her, she thought it was a gibbet, and a dead man hanging. And then she realized it was the signboard of the inn, that somehow or other, through neglect, had become insecure upon its nails, and now swung backwards, forwards, with the slightest breeze. Nothing but a poor battered board that had once known prouder days in its first erection, but whose white lettering was now blurred and grey, and whose message was at the mercy of the 4 winds. Jamaica Inn, Jamaica Inn. Mary pulled down the blind and crept to her bed. Her teeth were chattering, and her feet and hands were numb. For a long while she sat huddled on the bed, a prey to despair. She wondered whether it were possible to break from the house and find her way back the 12 long miles to Bodmin. She wondered whether her weariness would prove too much for her, and if, with an agony of fatigue, she would drop by the roadside and fall asleep where she lay, only to be wakened by the morning light and to see the great form of Jos Merlyn towering above her. She closed her eyes, and at once she saw his face smiling at her, and then the smile changing to a frown, and the frown breaking into 1,000 creases as he shook with rage, and she saw his great mat of black hair, his hooked nose, and the long, powerful fingers that held such deadly grace. She felt caught here now, like a bird in a net, and however much she struggled she would never escape. If she wished to be free, she must go now, climb from her window, and run like a mad thing along the white road that stretched like a snake across the moors. Tomorrow it would be too late. She waited until she heard his footsteps on the stairs. She heard him mutter to himself, and to her relief he turned aside and went along the other passage to the left of the staircase. In the distance a door closed, and there was silence. She decided she would wait no longer. If she stayed even one night beneath this roof, her nerve would go from her, and she would be lost and mad and broken like Aunt Patience. She opened the door and stole into the passage. She tiptoed to the head of the stairs. She paused and listened. Her hand was on the banister and her foot on the top stair, when she heard a sound from the other passage. It was somebody crying. It was someone whose breath came in little gasps and spasms, and who tried to muffle the sound in a pillow. It was Aunt Patience. Mary waited a moment, and then she turned back and went to her own room again, and threw herself on her bed and closed her eyes. Whatever she would have to face in the future, and however frightened she would be, she would not leave Jamaica Inn now. She must stay with Aunt Patience. She was needed here. It might be that Aunt Patience would take comfort from her, and they would come to an understanding, and in some way which she was now too tired to plan, Mary would act as a protector to Aunt Patience, and stand between her and Jos Merlyn. For 17 years her mother had lived and worked alone, and known greater hardships than Mary would ever know. She would not have run away because of a half-crazy man. She would not have feared a house that reeked of evil, however lonely it stood on its wind-blown hill, a solitary landmark defying man and storm. Mary's mother would have the courage to fight her enemies, yes, and conquer them in the end. There would be no giving way for her. And so Mary lay upon her hard bed, her mind teeming while she prayed for sleep. Every sound a fresh stab to her nerves, from the scratching of a mouse in the wall behind her to the creaking of the sign in the yard. She counted the minutes and the hours of an eternal night, and when the first cock crew in a field behind the house, she counted no more, but sighed and slept like a dead thing. Chapter 3. Mary woke to a high wind from the west, and a thin, watery sun. It was the rattling of her window that roused her from her sleep, and she judged from the broad daylight and the colour of the sky that she had slept late, and that it must be past 8 o'clock. Looking out of the window and across the yard, she saw that the stable door was open, and there were fresh hoof marks in the mud outside. With a great sense of relief, she realized that the landlord must have gone from home, and she would have Aunt Patience to herself, if only for a little time. Hurriedly she unpacked her trunk, pulling out her thick skirt and coloured apron, and the heavy shoes she had worn at the farm, and in 10 minutes she was down in the kitchen and washing in the scullery at the back. Aunt Patience came in from the chicken run behind the house with some new-laid eggs in her apron, which she produced with a little smile of mystery. "I thought you'd like one for your breakfast," she said. "I saw you were too tired to eat much last night, and I saved you a spot of cream for your bread." Her manner was normal enough this morning, and in spite of the red rims round her eyes, which bespoke an anxious night, she was obviously making an effort to be cheerful. Mary decided it was only in the presence of her husband that she went to pieces like a frightened child, and when he was away she had that same child's aptitude for forgetting, and could seize pleasure from little situations such as this, of making breakfast for Mary and boiling her an egg. They both avoided any reference to the night before, and Joss's name was not mentioned. Where he had gone, and on what business, Mary neither asked nor cared. She was only too relieved to be rid of him. Mary could see that her aunt was eager to speak of things unconnected with her present life. She seemed afraid of any questions, so Mary spared her and plunged into a description of the last years at Helford, the strain of the bad times, and her mother's illness and death. Whether Aunt Patience took it in or not, she could not tell. Certainly she nodded from time to time, and pursed her lips, and shook her head, and uttered little ejaculations. But it seemed to Mary that years of fear and anxiety had taken away her powers of concentration, and that some underlying terror prevented her from giving her whole interest to any conversation. During the morning there was the usual work of the house, and Mary was thus able to explore the inn more thoroughly. It was a dark, rambling place, with long passages and unexpected rooms. There was a separate entrance to the bar at the side of the house, and though the room was empty now, there was something heavy in the atmosphere, reminiscent of the last time it was full. A lingering taste of old tobacco, a sour smell of drink, and an impression of warm, unclean humanity packed one against the other on the dark, stained benches. For all the unpleasant suggestion that it conjured, it was the one room in the inn that had vitality, and was not morne and drear. The other rooms appeared neglected or unused. Even the parlour by the entrance porch had a solitary air, as though it were many months since an honest traveller had stepped upon the threshold and warmed his back before a glowing fire. The guest rooms upstairs were in an even worse state of repair. One was used for lumber, with boxes piled against the wall, and old horse blankets chewed and torn by families of rats or mice. In the room opposite, potatoes and turnips had been stored upon a broken-down bed. Mary guessed that her own small room had been in much the same condition, and that she owed it to her aunt that it was now furnished at all. Into their own room, along the farther passage, she did not venture. Beneath it, down a passage that ran parallel to the one above, long and in the opposite direction from the kitchen, was another room, the door of which was locked. Mary went out into the yard to look at it through the window, but there was a board nailed up against the frame, and she could not see inside. The house and outbuildings formed three sides of the little square that was the yard, in the centre of which was a grass bank and a drinking trough. Beyond this lay the road, a thin white ribbon that stretched on either hand to the horizon, surrounded on each side by moorland, brown and sodden from the heavy rains. Mary went out onto the road and looked about her, and as far as her eyes could see there was nothing but the black hills and the moors. The grey slate inn with its tall buildings, forbidding and uninhabited though it seemed, was the only dwelling place on the landscape. To the west of Jamaica, high tors raised their heads. Some were smooth, like downland, and the grass shone yellow under the fitful winter sun. But others were sinister and austere, their peaks crowned with granite and great slabs of stone. Now and again the sun was obscured by cloud, and long shadows fled over the moors like fingers. Colour came in patches. Sometimes the hills were purple, ink-stained and mottled, and then a feeble ray of sun would come from a wisp of cloud, and one hill would be golden-brown, while his neighbour still languished in the dark. The scene was never once the same, for it would be the glory of high noon to the east, with the moor as motionless as desert sand, and away to the westward Arctic winter fell upon the hills, brought by a jagged cloud shaped like a highwayman's cloak that scattered hail and snow and a sharp spittle rain onto the granite tors. The air was strong and sweet-smelling, cold as mountain air, and strangely pure. It was a revelation to Mary, accustomed as she was to the warm and soft climate of Helford, with its high hedges and tall protecting trees. Even the east wind had been no hardship there, for the arm of the headland acted as a defence to those on land, and it was only the river that ran turbulent and green, the wave-crests whipped with foam. However grim and hateful was this new country, however barren and untilled, with Jamaica Inn standing alone upon the hill as a buffer to the four winds, there was a challenge in the air that spurred Mary Yellan to adventure. It stung her, bringing colour to her cheeks and a sparkle to her eyes. It played with her hair, blowing it about her face. And as she breathed deep, she drew it through her nostrils and into her lungs, more quenching and sweeter than a draught of cider. She went to the water trough and put her hands under the spring. The water ran clear and icy cold. She drank some, and it was unlike any water she had drunk before, bitter, queer, with a lingering peat taste, like the smoke from the turf fire in the kitchen. It was deep and satisfying, for her thirst went from her. She felt strong in her body and emboldened in spirit, and she went back into the house to find Aunt Patience, her appetite sharp for the dinner that she hoped awaited her. She fell to with a will upon stewed mutton and turnips, and her hunger appeased now for the first time for 24 hours. She felt her courage return to her, and she was ready to question her aunt and risk the consequences. "Aunt Patience," she began, "why is my uncle the landlord of Jamaica Inn?" The sudden direct attack took the woman by surprise, and for a moment she stared at Mary without reply. Then she flushed scarlet and began to work her mouth. "Why?" she faltered. It's a very prominent place here, on the road, you can see that. This is the main road from the south. The coaches pass here twice a week. They come from Truro and Bodmin, and so on to Launceston. You came yourself yesterday. There's always company on the road, travellers and private gentlemen, and sometimes sailors from Falmouth." "Yes, Aunt Patience." "But why don't they stop at Jamaica?" "They do. They often ask for a drink in the bar. We've a good custom here." "How can you say that when the parlour is never used, and the guest rooms are stored with lumber, fit only for rats and mice? I've seen them for myself. I've been to inns before, smaller ones than this by far. There was an inn at home in the village. The landlord was a friend of ours. Many a time Mother and I had tea in the parlour, and upstairs, though there were only 2 rooms, they were furnished and fitted up in style for travellers." Her aunt was silent for a moment, working her mouth and twisting her fingers in her lap. "Your Uncle Jos doesn't encourage folk to stay," she said at length. "He says you never know who you're going to get. Why, in a lonely spot like this we might be murdered in our beds. There's all sorts on a road like this. It wouldn't be safe." "Aunt Patience, you're talking nonsense. What is the use of an inn that cannot give an honest traveller a bed for the night? For what other purpose was it built? And how do you live if you have no custom?" "We have custom," returned the woman. "I've told you that. There's men come in from the farms and outlying places. There are farms and cottages scattered over these moors for miles around, and folk come from there. There are evenings when the bar is full of them. A driver on the coach yesterday told me respectable people did not come to Jamaica any more. He said they were afraid." Aunt Patience changed colour. She was pale now, and her eyes roved from side to side. She swallowed and ran her tongue over her lips. "Your Uncle Jos has a strong temper," she said. "You've seen that for yourself. He's easily roused. He will not have folk interfering with him. Aunt Patience, why should anyone interfere with the landlord of an inn who goes about his rightful business? However hot-tempered a man may be, his temper doesn't scare people away. That's no excuse." Her aunt was silent. She had come to the end of her resources, and sat stubborn as a mule. She would not be drawn. Mary tried another question. "Why did you come here in the first place? My mother knew nothing of this. We believed you to be in Bodmin. You wrote from there when you married." I met your uncle in Bodmin, but we never lived there," replied Aunt Patience.
We lived near Padstow for a while, and then we came here. Your uncle bought the inn from Mr. Bassett. It had stood empty a number of years, I believe, and your uncle decided it would suit him. He wanted to settle down. He's travelled a lot in his time. He's been to more places than I can remember the names. I believe he was in America once. It seems a funny thing to come to this place to settle, said Mary. He couldn't have chosen much worse, could he? It's near his old home, said her aunt. Your uncle was born only a few miles away, over on 12 Men's Moor. His brother Jem lives there now in a bit of a cottage when he's not roaming the country. He comes here sometimes, but your Uncle Jos does not care for him much. Does Mr. Bassett ever visit the inn? No. Why not, if he sold it to my uncle? Aunt Patience fidgeted with her fingers and worked her mouth. There was some misunderstanding, she replied. Your uncle bought it through a friend. Mr. Bassett did not know who Uncle Jos was until we were settled in. And then he was not very pleased. Why did he mind? He had not seen your uncle since he lived at Trewarther as a young man. Your uncle was wild as a lad. He got a name for acting rough. It wasn't his fault, Mary. It was his misfortune. The Merlyns all were wild. His young brother Jem is worse than ever he was, I am sure of that. But Mr. Bassett listened to a pack of lies about Uncle Jos, and was in a great way when he discovered that he'd sold Jamaica to him. There. That's all there is to it. She leant back in her chair, exhausted from her cross-examination. Her eyes begged to be excused further questioning, and her face was pale and drawn. Mary saw she had suffered enough, but with the rather cruel audacity of youth she ventured one question more. "Aunt Patience," she said, "I want you to look at me and answer me this, and then I won't worry you again. What has the barred room at the end of the passage to do with the wheels that stop outside Jamaica Inn by night?" As soon as she had spoken, she was sorry, and like many a one before her who has spoken too hastily and too soon, she yearned for the words to be unsaid. It was too late, though, now. The damage had been done. A strange expression crept upon the woman's face, and her great hollow eyes stared across the table in terror. Her mouth trembled, and her hand wandered to her throat. She looked fearful, haunted. Mary pushed back her chair and knelt by her side. She put her arms round Aunt Patience and held her close and kissed her hair. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be angry with me. I'm rude and impertinent. It's none of my business, and I've no right to question you, and I'm ashamed of myself. Please, please forget what I said." Her aunt buried her face in her hands. She sat motionless, and paid no attention to her niece. For some minutes they sat there in silence, while Mary stroked her shoulders and kissed her hands. Then Aunt Patience uncovered her face and looked down at her. The fear had gone from her eyes, and she was calm. She took Mary's hands in hers and gazed into her face. "Mary," she said, and her voice was hushed and low, scarcely above a whisper. "Mary, I can't answer your questions, for there's many I don't know the answer of myself. But because you are my niece, my own sister's child, I must give you a word of warning." She glanced over her shoulder, as though she were afraid that Jos himself stood in the shadows behind the door. There's things that happen at Jamaica, Mary, that I've never dared to breathe. Bad things. Evil things. I can't never tell you. I can't even admit them to myself. Some of it in time you'll come to know. You can't avoid it living here. Your Uncle Joss mixes with strange men who follow a strange trade. Sometimes they come by night, and from your window above the porch you'll hear footsteps and voices and knocking at the door. Your uncle lets them in, and he takes them along that passage to the room with the locked door. They go inside, and from my bedroom above I can hear the mutter of their voices through the long hours. Before dawn they're away, and no sign left that they have ever been. When they come, Mary, you will say nothing to me or to your Uncle Joss. You must lie in your bed and put your fingers to your ears. You must never question me, nor him, nor anyone. For if you came to guess but half of what I know, your hair would go grey, Mary, as mine has done, and you would tremble in your speech and weep by night, and all that lovely, careless youth of yours would die, Mary, as mine has died.
Then she rose from the table and pushed aside her chair, and Mary heard her climb the staircase with heavy, faltering feet, and so along the landing to her room and close the door. Mary sat on the floor beside the empty chair, and she saw through the kitchen window that the sun had already disappeared behind the farthest hill, and that before many hours had passed, the grey malevolence of a November dusk would have fallen upon Jamaica once again. Chapter 4. Joss Merlyn was away from home for nearly a week, and during that time Mary came to know something of the country. Her presence was not required in the bar, for no one came to it when the landlord was from home, and after giving her aunt a hand with the housework and in the kitchen, she was free to wander where she pleased. Patience Merlyn was no walker. She had no wish to stir beyond the chicken run at the back of the inn, and she had no sense of direction. She had a vague idea of the names of the tors, for she had heard them mentioned by her husband, but where they were, and how anyone found them, she did not know. So Mary would strike off on her own at midday, with nothing but the sun to guide her, and a certain deep-grained common sense which was her natural inheritance as a countrywoman. The moors were even wilder than she had at first supposed. Like an immense desert, they rolled from east to west, with tracks here and there across the surface, and great hills breaking the skyline. Where was their final boundary she could not tell, except that once, away to the westward, after climbing the highest tor behind Jamaica, she caught the silver shimmer of the sea. It was a silent, desolate country, though, vast and untouched by human hand. On the high tors the slabs of stone leant against one another in strange shapes and forms, massive sentinels who had stood there since the hand of God first fashioned them. Some were shaped like giant furniture, with monstrous chairs and twisted tables, and sometimes the smaller crumbling stones lay on the summit of the hill like a giant himself, his huge recumbent form darkening the heather and the coarse tufted grass. There were long stones that stood on end, balancing themselves in a queer, miraculous way, as though they leant against the wind, and there were flat altar stones, whose smooth and polished faces stared up towards the sky, awaiting a sacrifice that never came. Wild sheep dwelt on the high tors, and there were ravens too, and buzzards. The hills were homing places for all solitary things. Black cattle gazed on the moors beneath, their careful feet treading the firm ground, and with inborn knowledge they avoided the tufted, tempting grass that was not grass at all, but soggy marsh that sighed and whispered. When the wind blew on the hills, it whistled mournfully in the crevices of granite, and sometimes it shuddered like a man in pain. Strange winds blew from nowhere. They crept along the surface of the grass, and the grass shivered. They breathed upon the little pools of rain in the hollowed stones, and the pools rippled. Sometimes the wind shouted and cried, and the cry echoed in the crevices and moaned, and was lost again. There was a silence on the tors that belonged to another age, an age that is past and vanished as though it had never been, an age when man did not exist, but pagan footsteps trod upon the hills. And there was a stillness in the air, and a stranger, older peace that was not the peace of God. As Mary Yellan walked the moors, climbed the tors, and rested in the low dips beside the springs and streams, she thought about Jos Merlyn, and what his boyhood must have been, and how he grew athwart like the stunted broom, with the bloom blown out of him by the north wind. One day she crossed the east moor in the direction he had given her that first evening. And when she had gone some way, and stood alone upon a ridge of down, surrounded on all sides by bleak moorland, she saw that the land descended to a deep and treacherous marsh, through which a brook burbled and sang. And rising beyond the marsh, away on the other side, pointing his great fingers to the sky, was a crag like a split hand coming sheer out of the moor, his surface moulded in granite as though sculptured, his slope a venomous grey. So this was Kilmar Tor, and somewhere amongst that solid mass of stone, where the ridges hid the sun, Jos Merlyn had been born, and his brother lived today. Below her in the marsh, Matthew Merlyn had been drowned. In her fancy she saw him stride across the high ground, whistling a song, the murmur of the brook in his ears, and somehow evening came upon him before he was aware, and his footsteps faltered as he turned in his tracks. In her fancy she watched him pause and think a moment and curse softly, and then, with a shrug of his shoulders, he plunged down into the mist, his confidence returning. But before he had taken 5 steps he felt the ground sag under his feet, and he stumbled and fell, and suddenly he was up above his knees in weed and slime. He reached out for a tuft of grass, and it sank beneath his weight. He kicked with his feet, and they would not answer him. He kicked once more, and one foot sucked itself free, but as he plunged forward, reckless and panic-stricken, he trod deeper water still, and now he floundered helplessly, beating the weed with his hands. She heard him scream in terror, and a curlew rose from the marsh in front of him, flapping his wings and whistling his mournful cry. When the curlew had flown from sight, disappearing behind a ridge of land, the marsh was still again. Only a few grass stems shivered in the wind, and there was silence. Mary turned her back upon Kilmar, and began to run across the moor, stumbling amongst the heather and the stones, nor did she stop until the marsh had sunk beneath the level of the hill, and the crag itself was hidden. She had come farther than she intended, and the way home was long. It seemed an eternity before the last hill was conquered and behind her, and the tall chimneys of Jamaica Inn stood out before her above the winding road. As she crossed the yard, she noticed with sinking heart that the stable door was open and the pony was inside. Jos Merlyn had returned. She opened the door as silently as possible, but it rubbed against the stone flags and grated in protest. The sound rang in the quiet passage, and in a minute the landlord appeared from the back, bending his head under the beam. His shirt sleeves were rolled above his elbow, and he had a glass in his hand and a cloth. He was, it seemed, in high good humour, for he shouted boisterously at Mary, and waved the glass.
"Well," he roared, "don't drop your face a mile at the sight of me. Aren't you pleased to see me? Didn't you miss me much?"
Mary made an effort to smile, and asked him if he had had a pleasant journey.
"Oh, pleasant be damned," he answered. "There was money in it, and that's all I care. I've not been staying in the palace with the king, if that's what you mean."
He shouted with laughter at his joke, and his wife appeared behind his shoulder, simpering in harmony. As soon as his laughter died away, the smile faded from Aunt Patience's face, and the strained, haunted expression returned again, the fixed, almost idiot stare that she wore habitually in the presence of her husband. Mary saw at once that the little freedom from care which her aunt had enjoyed during the past week was now no more, and she had again become the nervy, shattered creature of before. Mary turned to go up the stairs to her room, when Jos called her.
"Here,"
he said.
No skulking up there this evening. There'll be work for you in the bar, alongside of your uncle. Don't you know what day of the week 'tis?"
Mary paused to think. She was losing count of time. Was it Monday's coach she had taken? That made today Saturday. Saturday night. At once she realized what Jos Merlyn meant. Tonight there would be company at Jamaica Inn. They came singly, the people of the moors, crossing the yard swiftly and silently, as though they had no wish to be seen. They lacked substance in the dim light, and seemed no more than shadows as they skirted the wall and passed under the shelter of the porch to knock upon the door of the bar and gain admittance. Some carried lanterns, the fitful glare of which appeared to worry the bearers, for they attempted to screen the glow by covering it with their coats. One or two rode into the yard on ponies, whose hoofs rang sharply on the stones, and the clatter sounded strangely in the still night, followed as it was by the creaking of the stable door yawning on its hinges, and the low mutter of voices as the men led their ponies to the stalls. Others were yet more furtive, bearing neither flare nor lantern, but flitting across the yard with hats pulled low and coats muffled to the chin, betraying by the very secrecy of their movements their desire to remain unseen. The reason for stealth was not apparent, for any passing traveller upon the road could see that tonight Jamaica Inn gave hospitality. The light streamed from the windows, usually so shuttered and barred, and as the evening darkened and the hours went by, the sound of voices rose upon the air. There was singing at times, and shouting, and the rumble of laughter, showing that those visitors to the inn who came so furtively as if in shame had lost their fear when under cover of the house, and once packed close to their companions in the bar, with pipes alight and glasses filled, had thrown all caution aside. They were a strange assortment gathered there, grouped around Jos Merlyn in the bar. Securely separated by the counter itself and half-screened by a barrier of bottles and glasses, Mary could look down upon the company and remain unobserved. They straddled the stools and sprawled upon the benches. They leant against the wall, they slouched beside the tables, and one or two whose heads or stomachs were weaker than the rest already lay full length upon the floor. They were dirty for the most part, ragged, ill-kept, with matted hair and broken nails. Tramps, vagrants, poachers, thieves, cattle-stealers, and gypsies. There was a farmer who had lost his farm through bad management and dishonesty, a shepherd who had fired his master's rick, a horse-dealer who had been hounded out of Devon. One fellow was a cobbler in Launceston, and under cover of his trade passed stolen goods. He who lay in a drunken stupor on the floor was once mate of a Padstow schooner, and had run his ship ashore. The little man who sat in the far corner, biting his nails, was a Port Isaac fisherman, and rumour had it that he kept a store of gold rolled up in a stocking and hidden in the chimney of his cottage. But where the gold came from, no one would say. There were men who lived nearby, under the very shadow of the tors, who had known no other country but moorland, marsh, and granite. One had come walking without a lantern from the crowdy marsh beyond Rough Tor, taking Brown Willie in his stride. Another came from Cheese Ring, and sat now with his face in a mug of ale, his boots on a table, side by side with the poor half-witted fellow who had stumbled up the lane from Dosemary. This last had a birthmark that ran the whole length of his face, blazing it purple, and he kept plucking at it with his hands and pulling out his cheek, so that Mary, who stood in line with him, for all the bottles that divided them, turned sick and nearly faint at the sight of him. And what with the stale drink smell, and the reek of tobacco, and the foul atmosphere of crowded, unwashed bodies, she felt a physical disgust rise up in her, and she knew she would give way to it if she stayed there long. Luckily she did not have to move amongst them. Her duty was to stand behind the bar, hidden as much as possible, and then do what washing and cleaning of glasses was required, refilling them from tap or bottle, while Jos Merlyn himself handed them to his customers, or lifted the flap of the bar and strode out into the room, laughing at one, flinging a coarse word at another, patting someone on the shoulder, jerking his head at another. After the first hilarious outburst, the first curious stare, the shrug of the shoulder and the chuckle, the company gathered in the inn ignored Mary, They accepted her as niece of the landlord, a sort of serving-maid of Merlyn's wife, as she was introduced, and though one or two of the younger men would have spoken to her and plagued her, they were wary of the eye of the landlord himself, fearing that any familiarity on their part might anger him, as he had probably brought her to Jamaica for his own amusement. So Mary was left undisturbed, greatly to her relief, though had she known the reason for their reticence, she would have walked out of the bar that night in shame and loathing. Her aunt did not appear before the company, though Mary was aware of her shadow behind the door at times, and a footstep in the passage, and once she caught sight of her frightened eyes peering through the crack in the door. The evening seemed interminable, and Mary longed for release. The air was so thick with smoke and breath that it was hard to see across the room, and to her weary, half-closed eyes the faces of the men loomed shapeless and distorted, all hair and teeth, their mouths much too large for their bodies, while those who had drunk their fill and could take no more lay on the benches or the floor like dead men, their faces in their hands. Those who remained sufficiently sober to stand had crowded round a dirty little blackguard from Redruth, who had established himself wit of the assembly. The mine where he had worked was now in ruins, and he had taken to the road as tinker, pedlar, bagman, and had stored up in consequence a string of loathsome songs, gleaned perhaps from the bowels of the black earth where he had once entombed himself, and with these jewels he now provided entertainment to the company at Jamaica Inn. The laughter that greeted his sallies nearly shook the roof, topped, of course, by the bellow of the landlord himself, and to Mary there was something appalling in this ugly, screaming laughter, which in some strange way held not a note of mirth, but echoed down the dark stone passages and into the empty rooms above like a tortured thing. The pedlar was making bait of the wretched idiot from Dozmery, who, crazy from drink, had no control of himself and could not rise from the floor, where he squatted like an animal. They lifted him onto a table, and the pedlar made him repeat the words of his songs, complete with actions, amid the frenzy of laughter from the crowd. And the poor beast, excited by the applause that greeted him, jigged up and down on the table, whinnying delight, plucking at his spotted purple birthmark with a broken fingernail. Mary could bear it no longer. She touched her uncle on the shoulder, and he turned to her, his face blotched with the heat of the room and streaming with perspiration. "I can't stand this," she said. "You'll have to attend to your friends yourself. I'm going upstairs to my room." He wiped the sweat from his forehead with his shirt-sleeve and stared down at her. She was surprised to see that, although he had been drinking during the evening, he was himself sober, and even if he was the ringleader of this riotous, crazy company, he knew what he was doing.
"Had enough of it, have you?"
he said.
"Think yourself a little bit too good for such as we? I'll tell you this, Mary. You've had an easy time behind the bar, and you ought to go down on your knees and thank me for it. Because you're my niece, they've let you alone, my dear. But if you hadn't had that honour, by God, there wouldn't be much left of you now."
He shouted with laughter, and pinched her cheek between his finger and thumb, hurting her.
"Get out, then," he said. "'Tis close on midnight anyway, and I don't want you. You'll lock your door tonight, Mary, and pull down your blind. Your aunt's been in bed an hour, with a blanket drawn over her head."
He lowered his voice. Bending down to her ear and seizing her wrist, he doubled it behind her back until she cried out in pain.
"All right,"
he said.
"That's like a foretaste of punishment, and you know what to expect. Keep your mouth shut, and I'll treat you like a lamb. It doesn't do to be curious at Jamaica Inn, and I'll have you remember that."
He was not laughing now, but stared down at her, frowning, as though he would read her thoughts.
"You're not a fool like your aunt," he said. "That's the curse of it. You've got a clever little monkey face and a ferreting monkey mind, and you're not easily scared. But I tell you this, Mary Yellan, I'll break that mind of yours if you let it go astray. And I'll break your body too. Now, go upstairs to bed, and let's hear no more of you tonight."
He turned away from her, and frowning still, picked up a glass from the bar in front of him, turning it over and over in his hands, rubbing it slowly with a cloth. The contempt in her eyes must have irritated him, for his good humour had left him in a flash, and he flung aside the glass in a fit of ill temper, splitting it to fragments.
"Strip that damn idiot of his clothes," he thundered, "and send him back naked to his mother. Maybe the November air will cool that purple face of his and cure his dog tricks. We've had enough of him at Jamaica."
The pedlar and his group yelled in delight, and throwing the wretched half-wit on his back, began to tear off his coat and breeches while the bewildered fellow flapped out at them with useless hands, bleating like a sheep. Mary ran out of the room, slamming the door behind her, and as she went up the rickety stairs, her hands over her ears, she could not keep out that sound of laughter and wild song that echoed down the draughty passage, following her to her room, penetrating through the cracks of the floorboards. She felt very sick, and threw herself on her bed, her head in her hands. There was a babel of noise in the yard below, and yells of laughter, while a stream of light from a tossing lantern cast a beam up to her window. She got up and pulled down the blind, but not before she had seen the outline of a quivering, naked form bound across the yard with great loping strides, screaming like a hare, and pursued by a handful of hooting, jeering men, with Joss Merlyn's giant figure in the lead, cracking a horsewhip above his head. Then Mary did as her uncle had told her. She undressed hurriedly and crept into bed, pulling the blanket over her head, stuffing her fingers in her ears, her only thought now to be deaf to the horror and the revelry below. But even with eyes shut and face pressed tight against the pillow, she could see the purple-blotched face of the poor idiot man upturned towards his captors, and she could hear the thin echo of his cry as he stumbled into the ditch and fell. She lay in that half-conscious state that waits on the borderland of sleep, when the events of the past day crowd into the mind and make a jumble of confusion. Images danced before her, and the heads of unknown people, and though at times she seemed to be wandering on the moor with the great crag on Kilmar dwarfing the neighbouring hills, she was aware of the little path of light made by the moon on her bedroom floor, and the steady rattle of the window blind. There had been voices, and now there were none. Somewhere, far away on the high road, a horse galloped, and wheels rumbled, but now all was still. She slept. And then, without warning, she heard something snap in the peace of mind that had enfolded her, and she was awake suddenly, sitting up in bed, with the moonlight streaming on her face. She listened, hearing nothing at first but the thumping of her own heart. But in a few minutes there came another sound from beneath her room this time, the sound of heavy things being dragged along the stone flags in the passage downstairs, bumping against the walls. She got out of bed and went to the window, pulling aside an inch of blind. 5 wagons were drawn up in the yard outside. 3 were covered, each drawn by a pair of horses, and the remaining 2 were open farm carts. One of the covered wagons stood directly beneath the porch, and the horses were steaming. Gathered round the wagons were some of the men who had been drinking in the bar earlier in the evening. The cobbler from Launceston was standing under Mary's window, talking to a horse dealer. The sailor from Padstow had come to his senses and was patting the head of a horse. The pedlar, who had tortured the poor idiot, was climbing into one of the open carts and lifting something from the floor. And there were strangers in the yard, whom Mary had never seen before. She could see their faces clearly because of the moonlight, the very brightness of which seemed to worry the men, for one of them pointed upwards and shook his head, while his companion shrugged his shoulders, and another man, who had an air of authority about him, waved his arm impatiently, as though urging them to make haste, and the 3 of them turned at once and passed under the porch into the inn. Meanwhile the heavy dragging sound continued, and Mary could trace the direction of it without difficulty from where she stood. Something was being taken along the passage to the room at the end, the room with the barred windows and the bolted door. She began to understand. Packages were brought by the wagons and unloaded at Jamaica Inn. They were stored in the locked room. Because the horses were steaming, they had come over a great distance, from the coast perhaps, and as soon as the wagons were unloaded they would take their departure, passing out into the night as swiftly and as silently as they had come. The men in the yard worked quickly, against time. The contents of one covered wagon were not carried into the inn, but were transferred to one of the open farm carts drawn up beside the drinking well across the yard. The packages seemed to vary in size and description. Some were large parcels, some were small, and others were long rolls wrapped about in straw and paper. When the cart was filled, the driver, a stranger to Mary, climbed into the seat and drove away. The remaining wagons were unloaded one by one, and the packages were either placed in the open carts and driven out of the yard, or were borne by the men into the house. All was done in silence. Those men who had shouted and sung earlier that night were now sober and quiet, bent on the business in hand. Even the horses appeared to understand the need for silence, for they stood motionless. Jos Merlyn came out of the porch, the pedlar at his side. Neither wore coat or hat, in spite of the cold air, and both had sleeves rolled to the elbows.
"Is that the lot?"
the landlord called softly, and the driver of the last wagon nodded and held up his hand. The men began to climb into the carts. Some of those who had come to the inn on foot went with them, saving themselves a mile or two on their long trek home. They did not leave unrewarded. All carried burdens of a sort, boxes strapped over their shoulders, bundles under the arm, while the cobbler from Launceston had not only laden his pony with bursting saddlebags, but had added to his own person as well, being several sizes larger round the waist than when he first arrived. So the wagons and the carts departed from Jamaica, creaking out of the yard, one after the other in a strange funereal procession, some turning north and some south when they came out onto the high road, until they had all gone, and there was no one left standing in the yard but one man Mary had not seen before, the pedlar, and the landlord of Jamaica Inn himself. Then they too turned and went back into the house, and the yard was empty. She heard them go along the passage in the direction of the bar, and then their footsteps died away and a door slammed. There was no other sound except the husky wheezing of the clock in the hall, and the sudden whirring note preparatory to the strike. It rang the hour, 3 o'clock, and then ticked on, choking and gasping like a dying man who cannot catch his breath. Mary came away from the window and sat down upon the bed. The cold air blew in onto her shoulders, and she shivered and reached for her shawl. The thought of sleep now was impossible. She was too wide awake, too alive in every nerve, and although the dislike and fear of her uncle were as strong as ever within her, a growing interest and curiosity held the mastery. She understood something of his business now. What she had witnessed here tonight was smuggling on the grand scale. There was no doubt that Jamaica Inn was ideally situated for his purpose, and he must have bought it for that reason alone. All that talk of returning to the home of his boyhood was nonsense, of course. The inn stood alone on the great high road that ran north and south, and Mary could see that it must be easy enough for anyone with the capacity for organization to work a team of wagons from the coast to the Tamar Bank, with the inn itself as halting place and general store. Spies were needed about the countryside to make a success of the trade. Hence the sailor from Padstow, the cobbler from Launceston, the gypsies and the tramps, the vile little pedlar. And yet, allowing for his personality, his energy, the very fear which his enormous physical strength must engender in his companions, had Jos Merlyn the necessary brain and subtlety to lead such an enterprise? Did he plan every move and every departure? And had he been making preparations for tonight's work during the past week, when away from home? It must be so. Mary could see no alternative, and although her loathing for the landlord increased, she allowed herself a grudging respect for his management. The whole business must be controlled, and the agents picked, for all their rough manners and wild appearance. Otherwise the law could never have been evaded for so long. A magistrate who suspected smuggling would surely have suspected the inn before now, unless he were an agent himself. Mary frowned, her chin in her hand. If it were not for Aunt Patience, she would walk out of the inn now and find her way to the nearest town and inform against Jos Merlyn. He would soon be in jail and the rest of the rogues with him, and there would be an ending of the traffic. It was useless to reckon without Aunt Patience, however, and the fact that she still held a dog-like devotion for her husband made the problem difficult, and at the moment impossible. Mary kept going over and over the question in her mind, and she was not yet satisfied that all was understood. Jamaica Inn was a nest of thieves and poachers, who, with her uncle as leader apparently, worked a profitable smuggling trade between the coast and Devon. So much was clear. But had she seen only part of the game? And was there still more for her to learn? She remembered the terror in Aunt Patience's eyes, and those words spoken in the hush of that first afternoon when the shadows of early twilight crept across the kitchen floor. "There's things happen at Jamaica Inn, Mary, that I've never dared to breathe. Bad things, evil things. I dare not even admit them to myself." And she had climbed the staircase to her room, haunted and pale, dragging her feet like a creature old and tired. Smuggling was dangerous. It was fraught with dishonesty. It was forbidden strictly by the law of the land. But was it evil? Mary could not decide. She needed advice, and there was no one she could ask. She was alone in a grim and rather hateful world, with little prospect of changing it for the better. Had she been a man, she would have gone downstairs and challenged Jos Merlyn to his face, and his friends with him. Yes, and fought them too, and drawn blood if she were lucky. And then away on a horse from the stable with Aunt Patience riding pillion, and so down to the south again, to the friendly Helford shore, setting up as a farmer in a small way, up Morgan way, or Gweek, with her aunt to keep house for her. Well, there was little use in dreaming. The present situation must be faced, and courageously too, if any good were to come of it. Here she was on her bed, a girl of 23, in a petticoat and a shawl, with no weapons but her own brain to oppose a fellow twice her age and 8 times her strength, who, if he realized she had watched the scene tonight from her window, would encircle her neck with his hand, and pressing lightly with finger and thumb, put an end to her questioning. Then Mary swore, a thing she had only done once before in her life, when chased by a bull at Monacan, and then it had been for the same purpose as now, to give herself courage and a certain bold pretence. "I'll not fear before Jos Merlyn or any man," she said. "And to prove it, I will go down now in the dark passage and take a look at them in the bar, and if he kills me, it'll be my own fault." She dressed hurriedly and pulled on her stockings, leaving her shoes where they were, and then, opening the door, she stood and listened for a moment, hearing nothing but the slow, choking tick of the clock in the hall. She crept out into the passage and came to the stairs. By now she knew that the 3rd step from the top creaked, and so did the last. She trod gently, one hand resting on the banister and the other against the wall to lighten her weight. And so she came to the dim hall by the entrance door, empty except for one unsteady chair and the shadowed outline of the grandfather clock. Its husky breathing sounded loud beside her ear, and it jarred upon the silence like a living thing. The hall was as black as a pit, and although she knew she stood alone there, the very solitude was threatening, the closed door to the unused parlour pregnant with suggestion. The air was fusty and heavy, in strange contrast to the cold stone flags that struck chill to her stockinged feet. As she hesitated, gathering courage to continue, a sudden beam of light shone into the passage that ran at the back of the hall, and she heard voices. The door of the bar must have swung open, and someone came out, for she heard footsteps pass into the kitchen, and in a few minutes return again. But whoever it was still left the door of the bar ajar, as the murmur of voices continued, and the beam of light remained. Mary was tempted to climb the stairs again to her bedroom and seek safety in sleep, but at the same time there was a demon of curiosity within her that would not be stilled, and this part of her carried her through to the passage beyond, and so to crouch against the wall a few paces only from the door of the bar. Her hands and her forehead were wet now with perspiration, and at first she could hear nothing but the loud beating of her heart. The door was open enough for her to see the outline of the hinged bar itself, and the collection of bottles and glasses, while directly in front ran a narrow strip of floor. The splintered fragments of the glass her uncle had broken still lay where they had fallen, and beside them was a brown stain of ale spilt by some unsteady hand. The men must be sitting on the benches against the farther wall, for she could not see them. They had fallen to silence, and then suddenly a man's voice rang out, quavering and high, the voice of a stranger.
"No, and no again," he said. "I tell you for the final time I'll not be a party to it. I'll break with you now and forever and put an end to the agreement. That's murder you'd have me do, Mr. Merlyn. There's no other name for it. It's common murder."
The voice was pitched high, trembling on the final note, as though the speaker was carried away by the force of his feelings and had lost command of his tongue. Someone, the landlord himself, no doubt, made reply in a low tone, and Mary could not catch his words, but his speech was broken by a cackle of laughter that she recognized as belonging to the pedlar. The quality of it was unmistakable, insulting and coarse. He must have hinted a question, for the stranger spoke again, swiftly, in self-defence.
"Swinging, is it?" he said. "I've risked swinging before, and I'm not afraid of my neck. No, I'm thinking of my conscience and of Almighty God. I know I'll face any man in a fair fight, and take punishment if need be. When it comes to the killing of innocent folk, and maybe women and children amongst them, that's going straight to hell, Jos Merlyn, and you know it as well as I do."
Mary heard the scraping of a chair, and the man rise to his feet, but at the same time someone thumped his fist on the table and swore, and her uncle lifted his voice for the first time.
"Not so fast, my friend," he said. "Not so fast. You're soaked in this business up to your neck, and be damned to your blasted conscience. I tell you there's no going back on it now. It's too late. Too late for you and for all of us. I've been doubtful of you from the first, with your gentleman's airs and your clean cuffs, and by God I proved myself right. Harry, bolt the door over there and put the bar across it."
There was a sudden scuffle and a cry, and the sound of someone falling, and at the same time the table crashed to the floor, and the door to the yard was slammed. Once more the pedlar laughed, odious and obscene, and he began to whistle one of his songs.
"Shall we tickle him up like silly Sam?" he said, breaking off in the middle. "He'd be a little body without his fine clothes. I could do with his watch and chain, too. Poor men of the road like myself haven't the money to go buying watches. Tickle him up with the whip, Jos, and let's see the colour of his skin."
"Shut your mouth, Harry, and do as you're told,"
answered the landlord.
"Stand where you are by the door and prick him with your knife if he tries to pass you. Now, look here, Mr. Lawyer Clark, or whatever you are in Truro Town, you've made a fool of yourself tonight, but you're not going to make a fool of me. You'd like to walk out of the door, wouldn't you, and get on your horse, and be away to Bodmin, yes, and by 9 in the morning you'd have every magistrate in the country at Jamaica Inn, and a regiment of soldiers into the bargain. That's your fine idea, isn't it?"
Mary could hear the stranger breathe heavily, and he must have been hurt in the scuffle, for when his voice came it was jerky and contracted, as though he were in pain.
"Do your devil's work if you must," he muttered. I can't stop you, and I give you my word I'll not inform against you. But join you I will not, and there's my last word to you both."
There was a silence, and then Jos Merlyn spoke again.
"Have a care," he said. "I heard another man say that once, and 5 minutes later he was treading the air. On the end of a rope it was, my friend, and his big toe missed the floor by half an inch. I asked him if he'd like to be so near the ground, but he didn't answer. The rope forced the tongue out of his mouth, and he bit it clean in half. They said afterwards he'd taken 7 3/4 minutes to die."
Outside, in the passage, Mary felt her neck and her forehead go clammy with sweat, and her arms and legs were weighted suddenly as though with lead. Little black specks flickered before her eyes, and with a growing sense of horror she realized that she was probably going to faint. She had one thought in her mind, and that was to grope her way back to the deserted hall and reach the shadow of the clock. Whatever happened, she must not fall here and be discovered. Mary backed away from the beam of light and felt along the wall with her hands. Her knees were shaking now, and she knew that at any moment they would give beneath her. Already a surge of sickness rose inside her, and her head was swimming. Her uncle's voice came from very far away, as though he spoke with his hands against his mouth. "Leave me alone with him, Harry," he said. "There'll be no more work for you tonight at Jamaica. Take his horse and be off. Cast him loose the other side of Camelford. I'll settle this business by myself." Somehow Mary found her way to the hall, and hardly conscious of what she was doing, she turned the handle of the parlour door and stumbled inside. Then she crumpled in a heap on the floor, her head between her knees. She must have fainted quite away for a minute or two, because the specks in front of her eyes grouped themselves into one tremendous hole, and her world went black. But the position in which she had fallen brought her to herself quicker than anything else could have done, and in a moment she was sitting up, propped on one elbow, listening to the clatter of a pony's hoofs in the yard outside. She heard a voice curse the animal to stand still. It was Harry the pedlar, and then he must have mounted and driven his heels into the pony's side, for the sound of the hoofs drew away and out of the yard, and disappeared in the distance down the high road, and so were lost beneath the slope of the hill. Her uncle was alone now in the bar with his victim, and Mary wondered whether it would be possible for her to find her way to the nearest dwelling-place on the road to Dewsbury and summon help. It meant a walk of 2 or 3 miles across a moorland track before the first shepherd's cottage was reached, and somewhere on the same track the poor idiot boy had flown earlier in the evening, and was even now perhaps waiting and grimacing by the side of the ditch. She knew nothing of the inhabitants of the cottage. Possibly they belonged to her uncle's company, in which case she would be running straight into a trap. Aunt Patience, upstairs in bed, was useless to her, and if anything, an encumbrance. It was a hopeless situation, and there seemed no way of escape for the stranger, whoever he should be, unless he himself came to some agreement with Jos Merlyn. If he had any cunning, he might be able to overpower her uncle. Now that the pedlar had gone, they were evenly matched as far as numbers went, though her uncle's physical strength would tell heavily in his favour. Mary began to feel desperate. If only there were a gun somewhere, or a knife, she might be able to wound her uncle, or at least disarm him, while the wretched man made his escape from the bar. She felt careless now for her own safety. It was only a matter of time anyway before she was discovered, and there was little sense in crouching here in the empty parlour. That fainting attack had been a momentary affair, and she despised herself for her weakness. She got up from the floor, and placing both hands on the latch for greater silence, she opened the door a few inches. There was not a sound in the hall but the ticking of the clock, and the beam of light in the back passage shone no more. The door of the bar must be shut. Perhaps at this moment the stranger was fighting for his life, struggling for breath in the great hands of Jos Merlyn, shaken backwards and forwards on the stone floor of the bar. She could hear nothing, though. Whatever work there was behind that closed door happened in silence. Mary was about to step out into the hall once more, and creep past the stairs to the farther passage, when a sound from above made her pause and lift her head. It was the creaking of a board. There was silence for a minute, and then it happened again. Quiet footsteps pacing gently overhead. Aunt Patience slept in the farther passage at the other end of the house, and Mary herself had heard Harry the pedlar ride away on his pony nearly 10 minutes ago. Her uncle she knew to be in the bar with the stranger, and no one had climbed the stairs since she had descended them. There! The board creaked again, and the soft footsteps continued. Someone was in the empty guest room on the floor above. Mary's heart began to thump in her side again, and her breath came quickly. Whoever was in hiding up above must have been there many hours. He must have lain in waiting there since the early evening, stood behind the door when she had gone to bed. Had he gone later, she would have heard his footsteps on the stairs. Perhaps he had watched the arrival of the wagons from the window as she had done, and had seen the idiot boy run screaming down the road to Dewsbury. She had been separated from him by a thin partition of wall, and he must have heard her every movement, the falling onto her bed, and later her dressing, and her opening of her door. Therefore, he must wish to remain concealed. Otherwise he would have stepped out onto the landing when she had done. Had he been one of the company in the bar, he would have spoken with her, surely. He would have questioned her movements. Who had admitted him? When could he have gone into the room? He must have hidden there so that he should remain unseen by the smugglers. Therefore, he was not one of them. He was enemy to her uncle. The footfalls had ceased now, and though she held her breath and listened intently, she could hear nothing. She had not been mistaken, though, she was convinced of that. Someone, an ally perhaps, was hiding in the guest-room next to hers and could help her save the stranger in the bar. She had her foot on the lowest step of the stairs when the beam of light shone forth once more from the back passage, and she heard the door of the bar swing open. Her uncle was coming out into the hall. There was no time for Mary to climb the stairs before he turned the corner, so she was forced to step quickly back into the parlour and stand with her hand against the door. In the blackness of the hall he would never see that the door was not latched. Trembling with excitement and fear, she waited in the parlour, and she heard the landlord pass across the hall and climb the stairs to the landing above. His footsteps came to a halt above her head outside the guest-room, and for a second or two he waited, as though he too listened for some alien sound. Then he tapped twice, very softly, on the door. Once more the board creaked, and someone crossed the floor of the room above, and the door was opened. Mary's heart sank within her, and her first despair returned. This could be no enemy to her uncle after all. Probably Jos Merlyn had admitted him in the first place, early in the evening when she and Aunt Patience had been preparing the bar for the company, and he had lain in waiting there until all the men had departed. It was some personal friend of the landlord's, who had no wish to meddle in his evening's business, and would not show himself even to the landlord's wife. Her uncle had known him to be there all the time, and that was why he had sent the pedlar away. He did not wish the pedlar to see his friend. She thanked God then that she had not climbed the stairs and knocked on the door. Supposing they went into her room to see if she were there and asleep? There would be little hope for her once her absence was discovered. She glanced behind her at the window. It was closed and barred. There was no road of escape. Now they were coming down the stairs. They stopped for an instant outside the parlour door. For one moment Mary thought they were coming inside. They were so close to her that she could have touched her uncle on the shoulder through the crack of the door. As it was, he spoke, and his voice whispered right against her ear. "It's for you to say," he breathed. "It's your judgment now, not mine. I'll do it, or we'll do it between us. It's for you to say the word." Screened as she was by the door, Mary could neither see nor hear her uncle's new companion, and whatever sign or gesture he made in return escaped her. They did not linger outside the parlour, but turned back along the hall to the farther passage, and so down it to the bar beyond. Then the door closed, and she heard them no more. Her first instinct was to unbar the entrance, and run out into the road, and so be away from them. But on reflection she realized that by doing this she would gain nothing. For all she knew, there might be other men, the pedlar himself perhaps, and the rest of them, posted at intervals along the high road in the anticipation of trouble. It seemed as though this new man, who had hidden all evening in the room above, could not have heard her leave her bedroom after all. Had he done so, he would by now have acquainted her uncle with the fact, and they would search for her, unless they dismissed her as being of no importance whatsoever in the general scheme of things. The man in the bar was their first concern. She could be attended to later. She must have stood for 10 minutes or more, waiting for some sound or signal, but everything was still. Only the clock in the hall ticked on, wheezing slowly and impervious to action, a symbol of age and indifference. Once she fancied she heard a cry, but it was gone and lost in an instant, and was so faint and far a thing that it might have been some strange conjuring of her imagination, whipped as it was by all she had seen since midnight. Then Mary went out into the hall, and so through to the dark passage. No crack of light came under the skirting of the door to the bar. The candles must have been extinguished. Were they sitting there inside the room, all three of them, in darkness? They made an ugly picture in her mind, a silent, sinister group, ruled by some purpose that she did not understand. But the very snuffing out of the light made the quietude more deadly. She ventured as far as the door, and laid her ear against the panel. There was not even the murmur of a voice, nor that unmistakable suggestion of living, breathing people. The old fusty drink smell that had clung to the passage all evening had cleared, and through the keyhole came a steady draught of air. Mary gave way to a sudden, uncontrollable impulse, and lifting the latch, she opened the door and stepped into the room. There was nobody there. The door leading to the yard was open, and the room was filled with the fresh November air. It was this that caused the draught in the passage. The benches were empty, and the table that had crashed to the ground in that first scuffle still lay upon the floor, its 3 legs pointing to the ceiling. The men had gone, though. They must have turned to the left outside the kitchen, and walked straight onto the moor, for she would have heard them had they crossed the road. The air felt cold and sweet upon her face, and now that her uncle and the strangers had left it, the room seemed harmless and impersonal once more. The horror was spent. A last little ray of moonlight made a white circle on the floor, and into the circle moved a dark blob, like a finger. It was the reflection of a shadow. Mary looked up to the ceiling and saw that a rope had been slung through a hook in the beam. It was the rope's end that made the blob in the white circle, and it kept moving backwards and forwards, blown by the draught from the open door. Chapter 5. As the days passed, Mary Yellan settled down to life at Jamaica Inn with a sense of stubborn resolution. It was evident that she could not leave her aunt to face the winter alone, but perhaps with the coming of spring, Patience Merlyn could be persuaded to see reason, and the pair of them would leave the moors for the peace and quietude of Helford Valley. This was at any rate Mary's hope, and meanwhile she must make the best of the grim 6 months that lay ahead, and if possible she was determined to have the better of her uncle in the long run, and expose him and his confederates to the law. She would have shrugged her shoulders at smuggling alone, though the flagrant dishonesty of the trade disgusted her, but all she had seen so far went to prove that Jos Merlyn and his friends were not content with this only. They were desperate men, afraid of nothing and no one, and did not stop at murder. The events of that first Saturday night were never far from her mind, and the straggling rope's end hanging from the beam told its own tale. Mary had not a doubt that the stranger had been killed by her uncle and another man, and his body buried somewhere on the moors. There was nothing to prove it, however, and considered in the light of day, the very story seemed fantastic. She had returned to her room that night after the discovery of the rope, for the open door of the bar suggested that her uncle would be back at any moment, and, exhausted with all she had seen, she must have fallen asleep, for when she woke the sun was high, and she could hear Aunt Patience pattering about in the hall below. No sign remained of the evening's work. The bar had been swept and tidied, the furniture replaced, and the broken glass taken away, and there was no rope hanging from the beam. The landlord himself spent the morning in the stable and the cowhouse, pitchforking filth into the yard, and doing the work that a cowman should have done had he kept one. And when he came into the kitchen at midday to wolf an enormous meal, he questioned Mary about the farm stock at Helford, and asked for her opinion on a calf that had fallen sick, nor did he make any reference to the events of the preceding night. He seemed in fair good humour, and went so far as to forget to curse his wife, who hovered around him as usual, watching the expression in his eye like a dog who would please his master. Jos Merlyn behaved like a perfectly sober, normal man, and it was impossible to believe that he had murdered a fellow being only a few hours before. He might be guiltless of this, of course, and the blame rest upon his unknown companion, but at least Mary had seen him with her own eyes chase the naked idiot boy across the yard, and she had heard the boy scream as he felt the lash of the landlord's whip. She had seen him ringleader of that vile company in the bar. She had heard him threaten the stranger who opposed his will, and here he sat before her now, his mouth full of hot stew, shaking his head over a sick calf. And she answered, yes and no, in reply to her uncle, and drank down her tea, watching him over the brim of her cup, her eyes travelling from his great plate of steaming stew to his long, powerful fingers, hideous in their strength and grace. 2 weeks went by, and there was no repetition of Saturday night. Perhaps the last haul had satisfied the landlord and his companions, and they were content with that for the while, for Mary did not hear the waggons again, and though she was sleeping soundly now, she was certain that the noise of wheels would have woken her. Her uncle appeared to have no objection to her wandering on the moors, and day by day she came to know more of the surrounding country, stumbling upon tracks she had not noticed at first, and which kept her to the high ground, leading ultimately to the tors, while she learnt to avoid the low, soggy grass with tufted tops that by their very harmless appearance invited inspection, only to reveal themselves as the borderline of treacherous and dangerous marsh. Though lonely, she was not actively unhappy, and these rambles in the grey light of early afternoon kept her healthy at least, and went some way towards tempering the gloom and depression of the long, dark evenings at Jamaica, when Aunt Patience sat with her hands in her lap, staring at the turf fire, and Jos Merlyn shut himself up alone in the bar, or disappeared on the back of his pony to some unknown destination. Companionship there was none, and no one came to the inn for rest or nourishment. The driver of the coach had spoken the truth when he told Mary they never stopped now at Jamaica, for she would stand out in the yard to watch the coaches pass twice in the week, and they were gone by in a moment, rumbling down the hill and climbing the farther one towards 5 lanes without drawing rein or pausing for breath. Once Mary waved her hand as she recognized her driver, but he took no notice of her, only whipping his horses the harder, and she realized with a rather helpless sense of futility that so far as other people were concerned, she must be considered in the same light as her uncle, and that even if she tried to walk to Bodmin or Launceston, no one would receive her, and the doors would be shut in her face. The future loomed very black at times, especially as Aunt Patience made little effort to be companionable. And though now and again she took hold of Mary's hand and patted it for a few minutes, telling her how glad she was to have her in the house, for the most part the poor woman existed in a dream, pottering about her household duties in a mechanical fashion, and seldom uttering. When she did speak, it was to let forth a torrent of nonsense about the great man her husband might have been had not ill luck constantly followed him. Any normal conversation was practically impossible, and Mary came to humour her and talk gently as she would have done to a child, all of which was a strain on her nerves and on her patience. So that it was in a mood of truculence, following upon a day of wind and rain that had made it impracticable to venture out of doors, that Mary one morning set herself to clean down the long stone passage that ran the full width of the back of the house. The hard work, if it strengthened her muscles, did not improve her temper, and by the time she had finished she was so disgusted with Jamaica Inn and its inhabitants that for very little she would have walked out into the patch of garden behind the kitchen, where her uncle was working, heedless of the rain upon his mat of hair, and thrown her bucket of soapy water into his very face. The sight of her aunt, who with bent back poked at the dull peat fire with the end of a stick, defeated her. And Mary was about to start on the stone flags of the entrance hall, when she heard a clatter of hoofs in the yard, and in a moment someone thundered on the closed door of the bar. No one had approached Jamaica Inn before, and this summons was an event in itself. Mary went back to the kitchen to warn her aunt, but she had left the room, and looking out of the window Mary could see her pattering across the garden to her husband, who was loading turf from the stack into a barrow. They were both out of earshot, and neither could have heard the sound of this new arrival. Mary wiped her hands on her apron and went into the bar. The door must have been unlocked after all, for to her surprise there was a man sitting straddle-legged across a chair, with a glass in his hand filled to the brim with ale, which he had calmly poured out from the tap himself. For a few minutes they considered one another in silence. Something about him was familiar, and Mary wondered where she'd seen him before. The rather drooping lids, the curve of his mouth, and the outline of his jaw, even the bold and decidedly insolent stare with which he favoured her, were things known to her and definitely disliked. The sight of him looking her up and down and drinking his ale at the same time irritated her beyond measure. "What do you think you're doing?" she said. "You haven't any right to walk in here and help yourself. Besides, a landlord doesn't encourage strangers." At any other moment she would have laughed to hear herself speak thus, as though in defence of her uncle, but scrubbing the stone flags had done away with her sense of humour, if only for the moment, and she felt she must vent her ill temper on the nearest victim. The man finished his ale and held out the glass to be refilled.
"Since when have they kept a barmaid at Jamaica Inn?" he asked her.
And feeling in his pocket for a pipe, he lit it, puffing a great cloud of smoke into her face. His manner infuriated Mary, and she leant forward and pulled the pipe out of his hand, throwing it behind her onto the floor, where it smashed at once. He shrugged his shoulders and began to whistle, the very tunelessness adding fuel to her flame of irritation.
"Is this how they train you to serve customers?" he said, breaking off in the middle. "I don't think much of their choice. There are better-mannered maids in Launceston, where I was yesterday, and pretty as paint into the bargain. What have you been doing with yourself? Your hair's coming down at the back, and your face is none too clean."
Mary turned away and walked towards the door, but he called her back.
"Fill up my glass. That's what you're here for, isn't it?"
he said.
"I've ridden 12 miles since breakfast, and I'm thirsty."
"You may have ridden 50 miles for all I care," said Mary. "As you seem to know your way about here, you can fill your own glass. I'll tell Mr. Merlyn you're in the bar, and he can serve you himself if he has the mind."
"Oh, don't worry, Joss. He'll be like a bear with a sore head at this time of day," came the answer. "Besides, he's never very anxious to see me. What happened to his wife? Has he turned her out to make room for you? I call that hard on the poor woman. You'll never stay with him 10 years anyway."
"Mrs. Merlyn is in the garden if you want to see her," said Mary. "You can walk out of the door and turn to the left, and you'll come to the patch of garden and the chicken run. They were both of them down under 5 minutes ago. You can't go through this way because I've just washed the passage, and I don't want to do it all over again."
"Oh, don't get excited. There's plenty of time," he replied.
She could see he was still looking her up and down, wondering what to make of her, and the familiar, somewhat lazy insolence in his eyes maddened her. "Do you want to speak to the landlord or not?" she asked at length. "Because I can't stand here all day waiting your pleasure. If you don't want to see him and you've finished your drink, you can put down your money on the counter and go away." The man laughed, and his smile and the flash of his teeth struck a chord in her memory, but still she could not name the resemblance.
"Do you order Joss about in that way?" he said. "He must be a changed man if you do. What a creature of contradictions the fellow is, after all. I never thought he'd run a young woman alongside his other activities. What do you do with poor Patience of an evening? Do you turn her out on the floor, or do you sleep all three abreast?"
Mary flushed scarlet. "Joss Merlyn is my uncle by marriage," she said. "Aunt Patience was my mother's only sister. My name is Mary Yellan, if that means anything to you. Good morning. There's the door behind you." She left the bar and walked into the kitchen, straight into the arms of the landlord himself.
"Who in hell's name are you talking to in the bar?" he thundered. "I thought I'd warned you to keep your mouth shut."
The loudness of his voice echoed in the passage.
"All right," called the man from the bar. "Don't beat her. She's broken my pipe and refused to serve me. That sounds like your training, doesn't it? Come in here and let's have a look at you. I'm hoping this maid has done you some good."
Joss Merlyn frowned, and pushing Mary aside, he stepped into the bar.
"Oh, it's you, Jem, is it? What do you want at Jamaica today? I can't buy a horse from you, if that's what you're after. Things are going badly, and I'm as poor as a field mouse after a wet harvest."
He closed the door, leaving Mary in the passage outside. She went back to her bucket of water in the front hall, wiping the dirty mark from her face with her apron. So that was Jem Merlyn, her uncle's younger brother. Of course she had seen the resemblance all the time, and like a fool hadn't been able to place it. He'd reminded her of her uncle throughout the conversation, and she hadn't realized it. He had Joss Merlyn's eyes, without the blood-flecked lines and without the pouches, and he had Joss Merlyn's mouth, firm, though, where the landlord's was weak, and narrow, where his lower lip sagged. He was what Joss Merlyn might have been 18, 20 years ago, but smaller in build and height, neater in person. Mary splashed the water onto the stone flags and began to scrub furiously, her lips pressed tight together. What a vile breed they were then, these Merlyns, with their studied insolence and coarseness, their rough brutality of manner. This Jem had the same streak of cruelty as his brother. She could see it in the shape of his mouth. Aunt Patience had said he was the worst of the family. Although he was a head and shoulders smaller than Joss and half the breadth, there was a certain strength about him that the eldest brother did not possess. He looked hard and keen. The landlord sagged round the chin, and his shoulders weighed on him like a burden. It was as though his power was wasted in some way, and had run to seed. Drink did that to a man, Mary knew, and for the first time she was able to guess something of the wreck Joss Merlyn had become in comparison to his former self. It was seeing his brother that had shown her. The landlord had betrayed himself. If the younger one had any sense in his head, he would pull himself together before he travelled the same road. Perhaps he did not care, though. There must be a fatality about the Merlyn family that did away with striving forward and making good in life and resolution. Their record was too black. "There's no going against bad blood," her mother used to say. "It always comes out in the end. You may fight it as much as you like, but it will have the better of you. If 2 generations live clean, that may clear the stream sometimes, but likely as not the 3rd will break out and start it going again." What a waste it all was. What a waste and a pity. And here was poor Aunt Patience, dragged in the current with the Merlyns, all her truth and gaiety gone before her, leaving her, if the truth were faced, very little superior to the idiot boy at Dosemary. And Aunt Patience might have been a farmer's wife at Gweek, with sons of her own, and a house and land, and all the little happy trivialities of a normal happy life. Gossip with the neighbours, and church on Sundays, and driving into market once a week, fruit-picking and harvest time. Things she would have loved, things that had foundation. She would have known placidity, and they would be tranquil years that turned her hair in time to grey, years of solid work and calm enjoyment. All this promise she had thrown away to live like a slattern with a brute and a drunkard. Why were women such fools? So short-sighted and unwise, wondered Mary, and she scrubbed the last stone flag of the hall with venom, as though by her very action she might cleanse the world and blot out the indiscretions of her kind. She had worked up her energy to a frenzy, and turning from the hall proceeded to sweep the gloomy, dim parlour that had not seen a broom for years. A cloud of dust met her face, and she beat savagely at the wretched threadbare mat. She was so absorbed in her disagreeable occupation that she did not hear the stone flung at the window of the parlour, and it was not until a shower of pebbles made a crack in the glass that her concentration was disturbed. And looking out of the window she saw Jem Merlyn standing in the yard beside his pony. Mary frowned at him and turned away, but he made answer with another shower of pebbles, this time cracking the glass in earnest, so that a small piece of the pane splintered onto the floor with a stone beside it. Mary unbolted the heavy entrance door and went out into the porch. "What do you want now?" she asked him, conscious suddenly of her loose hair and rumpled, dirty apron. He still looked down at her with curiosity, but the insolence had gone, and he had the grace to appear the smallest bit ashamed of himself. "Forgive me if I was rude to you just now," he said. "Somehow I didn't expect to see a woman at Jamaica Inn. Not a young woman like you, anyway. I thought Joss had found you in one of the towns, brought you back here for his fancy lady." Mary flushed again and bit her lip in annoyance. "There's nothing very fanciful about me," she said. "I'd look well in a town, wouldn't I, in my old apron and heavy shoes? I should have thought anyone with eyes in his head could see I was farm-bred." "Oh, I don't know," he said. "Put you in a fine gown and a pair of high-heeled shoes, stick a comb in your hair, I dare say you'd pass for a lady, even in a big place like Exeter." "I'm meant to be flattered by that, I suppose," said Mary. "But thanking you very much, I'd rather wear my old clothes and look like myself." "You could do a lot worse than that, of course," he agreed. And looking up, she saw that he was laughing at her. She turned to go back into the house. "Come, don't go away," he said. "I know I deserve black looks for speaking to you as I did, but if you knew my brother as well as I do, you'd understand me making a mistake. It looks strange, having a maid at Jamaica Inn. Why did you come here in the first place?" Mary considered him from the shadow of the porch. He looked serious now, and his likeness to Joss had fled for the moment. She wished he were not a Merlyn. "I came here to be with my Aunt Patience," she said. "My mother died some weeks ago, and I have no other relative. I'll tell you one thing, Mr. Merlyn. I'm thankful my mother isn't alive to see her sister now."
"I don't suppose marriage with Joss is a bed of roses," said his brother. "He's always had the temper of the devil himself, and he drinks like a fish. What'd she marry him for? He's been the same as long as I can remember. He used to thrash me when I was a lad, and he'd do the same today if he dared."
"I suppose she was misled by his bright eyes," said Mary. "Aunt Patience was always the butterfly down in Halford, Mother used to say. She wouldn't have the farmer who asked her, but took herself off up country, where she met your brother. That was the worst day in her life, anyway."
"You've not much opinion of the landlord, then?" he said, mocking her.
"No, I have not," she replied. "He's a bully and a brute, and many worse things besides. He's turned my aunt from a laughing, happy woman into a miserable drudge, and I'll never forgive him for that as long as I live."
Jem whistled tunelessly and patted his horse's neck. "We Merlyns never been good to our women. I remember my father beating my mother till she couldn't stand. She never left him, though, but stood by him all his life. When he was hanged at Exeter, she didn't speak to a soul for 3 months. Her hair went white with the shock. I can't remember my grandmother, but they say she fought side by side with Grandad once near Callington, when the soldiers came to take him, and she bit a fellow's finger right through to the bone. What she had to love in Grandad I can't say, for he never as much as asked for her after he'd been taken. He left all his savings with another woman the other side of Tamar."
Mary was silent. The indifference in his voice appalled her. He spoke entirely without shame or regret, and she supposed that he had been born like the rest of his family, lacking the quality of tenderness.
"How long do you mean to stay in Jamaica?" he asked. "There's a waste for a maid like you, innit? There's not much company for you here."
"I can't help that," said Mary. "I'm not going away unless I take my aunt with me. I'd never leave her here alone, not after what I've seen."
Jem bent down to brush a piece of dirt from his pony's shoe. "What have you learnt in your short time?" he questioned. "It's quiet enough here, in all conscience."
Mary was not easily led. For all she knew, her uncle had prompted his brother to speak to her, hoping in this way to obtain information. No, she was not quite such a fool as that. She shrugged her shoulders, dismissing the subject. "I helped my uncle in the bar one Saturday night," she said, "and I did not think much of the company he kept."
"I don't suppose you did. The fellows who come to Jamaica have never been taught manners. They spend too much time in the county jail. I wonder what they thought of you. Made the same mistake as I did, I suppose, and are now spreading your fame far and wide about the countryside. You'll have Joss throwing dice for you next time, I dare say. And when he loses, you'll find yourself riding pillion behind a dirty poacher from the other side of Rough Tor."
"There's not much likelihood of that," said Mary. "They'd have to knock me senseless before I rode pillion with anyone."
"Senseless or conscious, women are pretty much the same when you come down to it. Poachers on Bodmin Moor would never know the difference anyway." And he laughed again, and looked exactly like his brother.
"What do you do for a livelihood?" asked Mary, in sudden curiosity. For during their conversation she became aware that he spoke better than his brother.
"I'm a horse thief," he said, pleasantly. "But there's not much money in it, really. My pockets are always empty. You ought to ride here. I've got a little pony that would suit you handsomely. He's over at thwarted now. Why don't you come back with me and look at him?"
"Aren't you afraid of being caught?" said Mary.
"Thieving is an awkward thing to prove. Supposing a pony strays from his pen and his owner goes to look for him, wow, you've seen for yourself. These moors are alive with wild horses and cattle. It's not going to be so easy for that owner to find his pony. Say the pony had a long mane, and one white foot and a diamond mark in his ear. That narrows the field down a bit, doesn't it? And off goes the owner to Launceston Fair with his eyes wide open.
but he doesn't find his pony. Mark you, the pony's there, right enough, and he's bought by some dealer and sold away up country. Only his mane is clipped, his 4 feet are all the same colour, and the mark in his ear is a slit, not a diamond. The owner didn't even look at him twice. That's simple enough, isn't it? So simple that I can't understand why you don't ride past Jamaica in your own coach with a powdered footman on the step, said Mary, swiftly. Ah, well, there you are, he said, shaking his head. I've never had the brain for figures. You'd be surprised to learn how quickly money slips through my fingers. Do you know, I had £10 in my pocket last week. I've only a shilling piece today. That's why I want you to buy that little pony. Mary laughed in spite of herself. He was so frank in his dishonesty that she had not the heart to be angry with him. I can't spend my small savings on horses, she said. I'm laying aside for my old age, and if ever I get away from Jamaica I shall need every penny, you may depend on that. Jem Merlyn looked at her gravely, and then, on a sudden impulse, he bent towards her, first glancing over her head into the porch beyond. Look here, he said. I'm serious now. You can forget all the nonsense I told you. Jamaica Inn is no place for a maid, nor for any woman if it comes to that. My brother and I have never been friends, and I can say what I like about him. We go our own ways and be damned to one another. But there's no reason why you should be caught up in his dirty schemes. Why don't you run away? I'd see you on the road to Bodmin, all right. His tones were persuasive, and Mary could almost have trusted him, but she could not forget he was Joss Merlyn's brother, and as such might betray her. She dared not make a confidant of him, not yet, anyway. Time would show whose side he was on. I don't need any help, she said. I can look after myself. Jem threw his leg over the pony's back and stuck his feet into the leathers. All right, he said. I won't worry you. My cottage is across the Withy Brook, if you ever want me. They're aside of Trewartha Marsh at the foot of 12 Men's Moor. I shall be there until the spring anyway. Good day to you. And he was off, and away down the road before she had time to say a word in return. Mary went slowly back into the house. She would have trusted him had his name been other than Merlyn. She was in urgent need of a friend. But she could not make a friend of the landlord's brother. He was no more than a common horse-thief, a dishonest scoundrel when all was said and done. He was little better than Harry the Pedlar and the rest of them. Because he had a disarming smile and his voice was not unpleasing, she had been ready to believe him, and he all the time perhaps laughing at her, the other side of his face. There was bad blood in him. He broke the law every day of his life, and whatever way she looked at it, there was no escaping from that one unredeemable fact. He was Joss Merlyn's brother. He had said there was no bond between them, but even that might be a lie to enlist her sympathy, while the whole of their conversation perhaps had been prompted by the landlord in the bar. No, whatever happened, she must stand alone in this business, and trust no one. The very walls of Jamaica Inn smelt of guilt and deceit, and to speak aloud in earshot of the building courted disaster. It was dark in the house, and quiet once more. The landlord had returned to the peat stack at the bottom of the garden, and Aunt Patience was in her kitchen. The surprise of the visit had been a little excitement, and a breaking up of the long, monotonous day. Jem Merlyn had brought something of the outer world with him, a world that was not entirely bounded by the moors, and frowned upon by tons of granite. And now that he had departed, the early brightness of the day went with him. The sky became overcast, and the inevitable rain came sweeping from the west, topping the hills in mist. The black heather bowed before the wind. The ill temper that had fastened upon Mary at the beginning of the morning had passed away, and in its place had stolen a numb indifference born of fatigue and despair. Interminably the days and weeks stretched themselves before her, with no other sight but the long white road to tempt her, the stone walls, and the everlasting hills. She thought of Jem Merlyn riding away with a song on his lips, kicking his heels into his pony's side, and he would ride hatless, careless of the wind and the rain, choosing his own road. She thought of the lane that led to Helford village, how it twisted and turned and wound suddenly to the water's edge, while the ducks paddled in the mud before the turn of the tide, and a man called to his cows from the field above. All those things were progressive and part of life, and they went their way without a thought of her. But she was bound here by a promise that she must not break, and the very patter of Aunt Patience's feet as she passed to and fro in the kitchen was a reminder and a warning. Mary watched the little stinging rain blur the glass of the parlour window, and as she sat there alone with her chin in her hand, the tears ran down her cheeks in company with the rain. She let them fall, too indifferent to wipe them away, while the draught from the door she had forgotten to close ruffled a long torn strip of paper on the wall. There had once been a rose pattern, but it was now faded and grey, and the walls themselves were stained deep brown where the damp had turned them. Mary turned away from the window, and the cold, dead atmosphere of Jamaica Inn closed in upon her.